Hello, viewers. I'm Tyson. This is my guest, Luke.
Oh, I'll be joining you today.
Yeah. Have you ever, and today we're just doing like an unstructured random discussion. We'll come up with a good title after it's done. Have you ever watched a YouTube series called On Cinema at the Cinema?
I have.
And how they always introduce the guy as the guest, even though
Yeah.
he's the only one.
Yeah, no, I love that. That whole thing is amazing. Did you end up seeing how that whole plot line unfolds and where it goes?
I have not watched like end to end, but I've watched a lot of it. So I know like the general thing, like he starts having the museum and all that shit, like
Yeah. Oh my God.
the
And
VHS tapes.
it slowly unravels to where he's like putting on a music festival and it goes horribly wrong.
Yeah.
Oh my God. That show it's pretty crazy.
The last one that I saw, it was like one of the Oscar specials that they did, and like he has for some like crap, I can't remember what movie, but some like B-list like movie from the 80s. He's got the traveling museum built out of his car or whatever of memorabilia.
I haven't seen that one, but oh man,
And they get in a huge fight like halfway through the show. So the guy goes to sit in his car and like does the rest of it from his car because he doesn't want to talk to him on stage.
oh my God.
Oh, it's so great.
Yeah, there's some
Tim and Eric are hilarious.
they are absolutely how that whole arc ends is magical. I think he's really good at doing these shows that have very surprising arcs that end up in a very dark or surprising place, and that is
And
no
you don't
exception.
expect them to have arcs like they say.
Yeah,
Like, have you watched the one where he's like doing a cooking show or whatever?
I have. I've seen that whole one. That's a pretty short one though, right? Only one season.
Yeah, I think it's like 6 episodes or something.
Yeah.
Have like the cook off with like the Spanish lady or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, I
Yeah,
gotta
it's
be
so
honest. This tastes like pretty low level chili and
good. That's right. He has his like sponsor of the mustard thing.
Pitzman's, yeah.
Oh my God, I have to watch that again. That's so ridiculous.
And he always spills all over the counter and then like scoops it back into the bowl with his hands.
Oh God, yeah. Oh, it's so good. Yeah, that man's hilarious.
Yeah.
Tim Heidecker. He did like a CD as well that was surprisingly good.
Like a stand-up?
Or like a music. He made like almost like a country folk-esque album. And it's like surprisingly good. Like I have one of the songs stuck in my head all the time.
I have not heard of that. I'll have to check it out.
Like, there goes Nicolas Cage waving at me, waving at me. That's the song that I'm a big fan of. And that was like nonsense about nothing. So
I know. I love how like just like unabashedly weird it is.
Yeah, it's good. I definitely overdose, and especially in the Tim and Eric show, I overdose pretty hard, and I have to do it in small doses because it's just so abstract.
The one they do, or it's like a parody of like Cosmos or whatever, and they like the one like the thing is from or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, did you know the universe has over 100 planets? Like, oh.
Oh man.
So speaking of planets,
and now
don't you think it's interesting that wood, like in the actual universe, like diamonds, for example, are like infinitely more common than wood, or like, you know, like whatever rare minerals. Like wood is such a uniquely just on Earth thing that happened, and even on other like planets with life, you wouldn't necessarily get wood. So like, if aliens come and colonize us, they're almost definitely coming for like the wood.
Yeah, I can see the value and the logic in that. Either that or some other very ubiquitous thing that's caused by the evolutionary process. But I can't think of maybe a better example than wood. So maybe like algae or something. Maybe they really use algae. Or like they find octopuses incredibly sexy, and it's like, oh my God, that's the perfect sex object. We're bringing it back to our planet to breed it.
Lovecraft comes here and he's like, man, look at all these tentacles. Like,
yeah, this is a hot, hot planet.
You guys figured some shit out.
To keep this Planet
Don't
safe,
these
secret from the
things
wife.
just grow naturally here? Like,
Yeah, no, I could definitely see that being a thing where like,
have you read
yeah,
Slaughterhouse-Five?
I have not. I actually
Okay.
think I purchased that one just now, actually.
You should. It's a great book. But one of the things in it is that they visit like an alien sex zoo where like they've got humans on display for like aliens to watch them have sex with each other and everything.
Hey, I did not realize that book was that like
Oh yeah.
sci-fi fantasy-esque. Crazy.
Everyone talks about like how it's a metaphor for like shell shock and all that. Nobody talks about the alien sex suit. That's like a good 10% of the book.
It's like every edition they like build it up a little bit larger. It's like
Exactly. I'm sure that Vonnegut was like, I wish I'd spent more time on the sex suit. Like, I just never quite got it.
yeah, I definitely cut way too much out of that. In further editions, I'm gonna
Yeah.
put more of my original
He's
content
doing his
back in
like
there.
behind the scenes thing, and he's like, like when I first brought my first edition, it was like this big.
Yeah.
It was all about the sex suit.
Damn
But of course, I had
editors.
to clean it up. Like,
Yeah. Public consumption. They don't get art. All they want is like, deep narratives about the human struggle with war and conflict.
yeah,
Bullshit.
I know. That kind of censorship is worse than just banning a book, in my opinion. I would much rather see a book just like completely pulled from the shelves than see it like sanitized by an editor.
Yeah. Although I can kind of see why you'd want to like Stranger in a Strange Land is a really cool book by Robert Heinlein. And it's got really cool themes in it, just really cool story. But then it has a few scenes that are like really rapey and really creepy.
Oh yeah.
And those were the ones that were actually pulled from the version that is out now. And so I had some friends who were reading it, and I'm like, oh, I'll listen to this audiobook that I found online, and I found the original audiobook with all the unredacted scenes in it. And I'm like, this is like really fucked up. And if I had read that book, it would be much more difficult for me to recommend it to others, and to like, it wouldn't be as ubiquitous.
It's like the Disneyfied version of it, right? Like you take all the like, oh, they boiled his hands and shit out of Brothers Grimm and make it into like Snow White. Like,
yeah, there you go. And I mean, so I can kind of see where it's like, it's such a good story. It wouldn't survive in a modern culture in its original form. And I almost am okay with it kind of adapting itself, or it being adapted to survive. But I can see how. I also respect the desire for the original content, and as long as people can still access the original version if they want, it's not just like.
It comes down to like how you see art, I guess. Like when you do that, I can totally see what you're saying, but my opinion is that like art is like about like a connection between you and the artist, and if you put people like, it's best in its raw form, because if you have like tons of editors and stuff like that, at like you don't have that connection anymore.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
Clearly he thought it was important to put it in there, or he wouldn't have put it in, right? Like,
yeah, and there's lots of scenes that are like, yeah, and lots of scenes that are like very disturbing, and lots of movies that really create the feeling and the vibe in a way that something less disturbing couldn't. And so that like moment in time is a necessary thing to like pull you into the grittiness.
One of my like favorite weird stories of editing. Are you familiar with The Clockwork Orange, either the book or the movie?
I've seen the movie before. I've never read the book.
Okay, so like the book is by Anthony Burgess, and it's like impossible to read. I cannot in good conscience recommend it to anyone, because like they use the weird language he made up throughout the whole thing, and like it's impossible to read. But interestingly, like all the rape and everything that's like it's famous for made it in, but in his original version there's a 21st chapter that's kind of about the characters like growing up and like moving on from like their youthful like shenanigans. Well, maybe right. Shenanigans is a light word, but like there's sort of like this redemption arc of like he becomes like a normal like productive member of society. And like that actually in the American release got cut, because they're like, this like people won't like this in America. Like we wanted to end on like the dark like sad note, and so they rewrote the ending to make it like more like dark and violent, because like his original vision they just thought like wouldn't jive with the American audience. So when you read
Right.
it in America, it only has 20 chapters, whereas the UK version has 21 chapters.
Interesting. And I guess in the American version, is that where he gets like, reprogrammed and he goes back onto the street and he gets beat up by his old crewmates?
Yeah,
That's
well,
the,
if you remember from the movie, the ending of that one is like he's in the hospital and all the people are standing around of how they're going to use him as like a major publicity point against this process and blah, 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 blah,
right.
blah. And like it sort of ends on just him again being like chewed up by the system and used for something else.
Being a pawn.
But like, in the original story, there's a sort of like redemptive arc of like him evolving past all of it.
The reprogramming presumably had a very positive effect on his life. And
Yeah, I think, and I've never read like a literary study, I think like the whole thing is sort of a metaphor for like our like growth into adulthood. I think that's why he chose to make it 21 chapters, because that's
cool.
kind of like so like you can kind of think of like you born as like this very like violent, needy, greedy baby thing, and like you're sort of then you go through like a social programming of like how to be better or whatever, and then you sort of like evolve past that. And like I think there's like that's always been my interpretation of the story. It's one of my favorite.
Yeah, no, I should read that book, because I guess
watch the movie again.
Yeah, I guess you're saying
it's one of the greatest movies of all time, and the book is hard to get through.
Yeah. Okay, I can meet you halfway on that for sure.
There you go.
I actually just recently rewatched True Romance.
Oh, I fucking love that movie.
Oh my god! And I had the last time I had seen it was in junior high on 8 Channel, so it was definitely not the. Speaking of redacted movies or redacted pieces of art, I definitely had not seen the original gritty version.
Oh, really?
So rewatching the actual movie with like, all of its incredibly disturbing nuance is awesome, and it's such a good movie. And absolutely, speaking to your point, it wouldn't have carried the same message and power without those scenes. And it's funny that I saw it when I was a teenager. I definitely did not see the same movie, because it's lacking so much.
I'm guessing they cut like the scene where she fights Tony Soprano in the bathroom, and they're both like completely covered in blood and everything.
I think they just really like kind of minimized it down to a few quick points. But like where he I know where he kills those 2 guys at the beginning of the movie, that was like much more minimized down to like a few quick shots, where it's like where in this version it's like so hardcore and intense.
I know. God. Quentin Tarantino wrote it, but he did not direct it.
I always knew he wrote
before he started directing.
Yeah, I always knew he was peripherally involved in it somehow. I didn't realize he wrote it. That's cool.
He's the screenwriter. You want to hear a fact that will blow your mind? Fucking M. Night Shyamalan wrote the screenplay for Stuart Little. Look that up on Wikipedia. That's a real fucking thing that happened. M. Night Shyamalan wrote Stuart Little.
That's a great trivia factoid. I did not know.
I had to check it. That was the first time in my life where I went to Wikipedia and I was like, this can't be real. I need another source.
Wow, that's so weird. I've seen Stuart Little.
That was like how he got his start. He was like a screenwriter. He wrote all sorts of like weird screenplays just like to make ends meet while he was trying to get the Sixth Sense budgeted, I guess.
That's so funny. I guess
when I had seen really like very briefly before the Sixth Sense came out, he wrote fucking Stuart Little.
Okay, yeah, and I guess that people don't associate him with that, because when that movie came out, they wouldn't have seen a recognizable name behind it.
No, I don't think it was like from the creator of Stuart Little.
Yeah. No, he probably was okay with distancing himself with that.
Yeah.
That's so
it's one of the weirdest facts ever, in my opinion.
Oh shit. I've been reading this new book. Have you read A People's History of America or United States?
No, I have not.
By Howard Zinn.
I've heard
it's like a very famous, it's like referenced in Good Will Hunting. It's a very culturally influential book. And I've been told to read Debunking Howard Zinn, which is supposed to unpack a lot of the historical inaccuracies and just kind of.
What is his like general thesis? Like, what is the book about? Like,
he claims to tell the story of the downtrodden throughout history. So
okay,
just like he wants to tell the story of slavery from the perspective of slaves, the story of Native Americans from the perspective of conquered Native American tribes,
Oh,
the
yeah.
story of World War II from the perspective of like the other side kind of thing. And yeah, in some ways, it's a really cool book. But it is absolutely the case that he presents, for instance, Native Americans as being very purely honorable in battle, whereas the conquering settlers, the British and French and whoever else, Spanish, they took no prisoners and they killed women and children, and they had a different approach to warfare. And while it's true that they did develop a different style of warfare, where they had long, big, slow-moving conquering armies, they were not unique in that they killed women and children. And so many times throughout history that we see a kind of a parity on both sides in terms of what people were willing to do. And there's also lots of settlers who tried to create, truces and good relations with the local inhabitants. So it's just a very kind of one-sided narrative of any of the settlers were just these greedy, after profit, willing to do anything in the name of it. And just the way he quotes history is very selective. And
yeah, for sure.
But yeah, it's unfortunate though, because this book that I'm reading, it's such blatant American propaganda. So while it does address a lot of the issues with Howard Zinn's book, it's also like tries to justify the Vietnam War as a good idea because, yeah, it's wild. And so I'm just like slogging my way through it right now, trying to make it to the end. It's brutal. I feel like we're gonna have to do I want to do a video where I'm addressing the points in Howard Zinn's book that are, have issues,
like,
but
nationalism weird. Like, I've always found it just bizarre that people are like at a very deep level, like they consider themselves to be Americans, and that's like part of who they are, and that's just weird to me.
Yeah, and I've been encountering a lot of people recently who are very intelligent and very thoughtful in many other ways. But they think nationalism, well, they just conflate it with the idea of community and collective identity and coming together under a banner of believing in something together. And I think, well, the difference between that and nationalism is, like, if you move to America, you're presumed to be necessarily a part of some giant community. So it's like this creepy, involuntary, gross cult, I think. And that's different than just a community and like coming together like, hey, we're all French, let's like celebrate French art and French culture and language. And
I've always found it fascinating how we like personify countries. Like, we'll talk about like Greece did this, or like Russia's always like that. Like, Russia's really warmongery, and you're like, what is Russia? Like,
yeah, we feel like we do that a lot with China right now, where people view China as just like this amorphous.
China's not going to put up with that. I'm like, what?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And I think it definitely, I know we mentioned this briefly before, but I definitely think nationalism is a concept that it props up other concepts and allows them to exist, and it facilitates other thinking that's very, I think, backwards. And so, well, on its own, I think nationalism isn't necessarily the most dangerous thing. It enables other backwards ideologies to flourish better, and it kind of,
I would kind of say like, and I've been thinking about this like a lot lately, but like I kind of think the human impulse of like conformity is at the root of a lot of like the issues in our society, and like nationalism is like a deeply conformist concept about like Americans are like this, like, real Americans are like this, blah, 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 blah. Like, and any idea that sort of bakes in like this idea of conformity, I think, is destructive ultimately to the individual.
Yeah, although I do think because humans are a social creature, you can have social institutions that involve conformity in a healthy way. There's one statement in philosophy that I really like, and that is that like problems come about through the arbitrary group distinctions. And so it's saying that all group distinctions should be meaningful. And I think the problem with nationalism, it's just completely arbitrary and meaningless. It's not based on a meaningful, measurable divide between Canadians and Americans, much like racism. It's an arbitrary distinction. And I think you can make me.
Yeah, sorry,
meaningful
go ahead.
distinctions. But yeah, it's just when you have those just random lines in the sand, it tends to cause problems.
Yeah, because like it leads to this mindset where like first you define the qualities of a group that don't necessarily apply to every individual, and then you judge each individual by those qualities, right? Like that's kind of like whenever you're putting people in a group, that's ultimately what you're doing. And sometimes it's productive, but ultimately I think it's a destructive habit.
Yeah, and I think maybe you could argue that there are some group distinctions that are meaningful because they reference something real and measurable in reality. Uh, but it's always kind of a dangerous thing to do. I think it's just such a natural tendency because we're such tribalistic creatures that we're going to always have a tendency towards, grouping into tribes in whatever form that is. And because that's just a natural tendency, I think we should try to avoid the more arbitrary group distinctions and just accept the fact that we're always going to do that would be my take. But
I kind of think it even goes deeper than like a tribalistic tendency, and just like the human brain is hardwired for pattern recognition, and that's what allows us to like do all of these brilliant things, but like that process isn't completely benign and can lead us to, because like very naturally we put anything into categories and like fit them into patterns and things like that without even like realizing that we're doing it. And I think we do that with people probably as well.
yeah, totally. And yeah, human psychology gets so complex when you try to unpack the nuances of our irrationality.
There's a theory that I may have mentioned on here before called the processing fluency theory of beauty, which is this concept of like things that we find beautiful and pleasing, we find that way because they like fit into that pattern finding algorithm extremely neatly. So like a certain painting, or like when you talk about like the idea of like beauty is defined by the golden ratio between like different widths on your face and stuff like that. So like a face that's built that way in some way like gets serialized in our brain much more efficiently than like a face that's all out of whack and doesn't fit into the normal dimensions. So we find that like face with those exact ratios more pleasing because in a very real sense, like to pardon the joke, like it's easier to look at. Like
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I know there's a famous Russian painter, I think it was Kandinsky, who famously wrote a book about the classic principles of I guess aesthetics, like what's pleasing to look at visually, and the golden ratio was a big part of that. And yeah, there's so many elements of paintings that you can define that are objectively more aesthetically pleasing based on what humans prefer to look at. And obviously you can,
I have a
cool
in my hallway actually.
Oh, sweet. Cool. I'm glad I for a second I'm like, am I mixing this name up with a serial killer?
Vasily Kandinsky.
Okay, yeah. I couldn't remember if that was a serial killer name or a Russian painter.
Probably both, but like
yeah, there you go. There's probably a lot of Kandinskys out there, but yeah, it's a really cool book and very famous. I forget the name of it, but my brother, being a quite accomplished painter, had it in our bathroom as I was growing up, and I used to leaf through it and look at the different principles of composition. Like apparently your eye likes to travel around the painting clockwise, and if you create lines around the edges of the painting that allow for that to take place, then your eye moves more comfortably through. Whereas if you create a line off the corner, your eye will just move off the page, and then it's like effort to move your eye back on the page, and it's even that small amount of effort makes it less pleasing to look at.
Totally. It's super interesting.
Yeah.
So wood stuff.
So anyway.
Do you ever think about how if we didn't have wood and wooden doors, we wouldn't have invented knocking? Like wood is like really the only material that you can knock on. Other than like maybe like eventually we would have had metal doors, but like stone or reeds or like anything like that wouldn't have had knocking, and we would have needed like a device to like announce our presence at somebody's door. Like wood is
such a stoner thought. That's awesome.
Wood is a uniquely suited material to being a front door.
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. I want to stress this perfectly right up, like you're not wrong. That's absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I want to believe that if a society developed far enough, they would probably, I mean, there's got to be other things like
what would you use? Like,
But I mean, that's the thing. I thought,
plastic is really what replaced wood. Like up until plastic, it
yeah,
was wood for like millennia, right? Like,
yeah,
and without wood, there wouldn't be oil and there wouldn't be plastic. Like,
it's true, man. It's really interesting trying to think about different lines of human development that would take place, or just,
just like another
intelligent
thing.
development.
Like, if there was no wood, how would you make fire? Like, the basic like campfire to cook my food and keep my house warm is always wood fed in like every society.
Yeah,
Like,
I
and the
mean,
replacement materials are few and far between and are poor substitutes.
I mean, yeah, it's kind of thing in a completely different evolutionary tree where there was completely different resources to draw upon. Maybe there would just be like a completely different, like, I don't know, like a type of organism that pooped out patties of these blocks that were contained bubbles of oxygen and very flammable. Like
Well, you can use like manure. That would have been something we stumbled upon eventually.
yeah,
But
we
would
did
we
do
have
that.
even like if we couldn't cook meat, would we have even like herded animals? Like, would that be a technology we like arrived at? Like, I don't know. It's just weird to think that like maybe wood is really like the defining aspect of our planet. Like people talk about like water or
Yeah.
whatever. Lots of planets have water. Lots of planets are warm. Ours is the only one that has wood. And like,
Although I guess, yeah, I mean, maybe if you knew enough about evolutionary history, you could argue that wood is an inevitable destination to arrive at, given the factors present like water and oxygen. But I don't know that, so yeah, I concede that it does seem like a very unique, and as you say, a very ubiquitous thing.
aliens are
It's,
gonna come to our planet and they'll be like, finally, we can make the front door. Like, our scientists have been developing it for centuries, but we can't figure out how to announce yourself when you're at the door.
it's
So we
like
built a spaceship to come and get some wood.
there's like this massive like fleet of aliens that lower down in front of, like, the Capitol building. Everyone's like, "Oh my God, it's happening!" And they just come out and
Yeah, it's like
silently
Settlers of
just,
Catan. They're like, we need wood.
they're
Like,
just like, "We need 2 wood. We got sheep. We got sheep."
yeah,
But they just lower themselves down, like just silently dig up a tree and like get back on the ship and take off. And we're like, "What the hell is that?"
right. I
And
really
there's
think, like, I've been thinking about it a lot this week. I really think that is what aliens would come from. That would be in an intergalactic commerce. The number one highest valued export of planet Earth would be wood.
I mean, I
I
think
struggle to
that's
think of anything else that like would be as useful.
I think that's a really cool idea for a short story. Although I do think a truly rational race of aliens would just come and take a bunch of seeds off to their
Well,
advanced.
maybe, but like, I don't know. Yeah, I guess it depends on how hard you think it is to like make wood somewhere else. Like,
Maybe we have the perfect conditions for growing,
yeah,
giant red cedar, which is maybe a very sought after form of wood.
yeah.
I,
I don't know. I've just been
I
thinking
like
about
this.
it. And like the fire thing is like weird too. Like I don't think we would have developed fire as a technology without wood. Like it would have been so difficult to sustain it. Like you can certainly burn grass or whatever.
That's
Like
true,
you
yeah.
need heaps and heaps of grass to like keep a fire going. And it wouldn't be like used the same way.
Yeah,
Right?
because
Like
certainly we've developed artificially burning logs and things like that, but would we even know that that was a useful thing to create if it weren't for regular logs? So it's
totally. Well, we wouldn't make like an artificial log. We'd make like, I don't know, briquettes probably, I guess.
what, sorry?
Like briquettes or whatever. Like we'd just make like more efficient. We would never, the log shape would never come to us. There's nothing like
Right.
magical about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know. It's weird to think about. I always wonder, like, I like to think about like how would we have developed differently if like you took one thing out of the mix. Like if we just never stumbled upon like the lever, like what would society look like? You
Uh-huh.
know, like I don't know. Ideas like that are very interesting to me.
Yeah, one thing that they talk about in this book, 1491, is that ancient South American cultures, they didn't develop the wheel, but they had a lot of technology based off of tension and just like, yeah, like fibers that were drawn to a point of tension and like creating like back pressure and leverage and whatnot. And I want to learn more about what they mean by that, because they kind of just referenced that in that book, but that kind of reminds me of what you're saying. Is that
totally? I was going to bring that up actually, so I'm glad.
Okay.
Yeah. Like another thing too is that the Aztecs in particular, although like this is true generally of like the Mesoamerican societies, because they had obsidian and it was so like widely available, and in many ways obsidian is a superior material for a lot of the things that we used metal for in the old world. And so like they didn't really develop metallurgy as much, because like things like knives, weapons, like all that shit, all the sharp things were all made of obsidian.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the ways that like they were ill-equipped to like do combat with Western peoples when we got here.
Yeah, it's almost like being in a position of doing without forced the Westerners to struggle and develop a new technology that allowed them eventually to overcome.
Yeah, exactly. Like there is some truth, I think, without going down like a weird rabbit hole here. Like I think there is truth to the idea that the societies that lived in like the shittiest, least hospitable part of the world, which is Europe, really, were forced to develop these things that then gave them a huge advantage in like the equatorial areas where like there was less of a sort of survival push, shall we say.
There's a great, another great example of that from that book, 1491. And that is that in the Amazon rainforest, and also that book pushes the idea that the Amazon rainforest was planted as a giant orchard. And so there was ancient civilizations that would live in the Amazon rainforest in this giant paradise they had created. And one of the main forms of labor, like pretty much all they did with labor was cutting down trees, because all they had was stone axes at the time.
Yeah.
And it would take about 2 weeks to cut down one tree with a stone axe, where all they were really doing was just turning one section into pulp until it eventually came down.
Yeah.
And when they acquired finally iron implements from other areas, they brought that down to like an 8-hour day to cut down this one massive tree. But I thought that was interesting how, because their society was so in certain ways well off with this beautiful rainforest, they never had to develop to such an extent where they could just put all their labor into like cutting down trees for days on end.
Yo, I'll present you with another like cool fact about Mesoamerica. Okay. So the avocado evolved to be a food source for the large megafauna mammals that used to exist in Central and South America. So there used to be essentially like these gigantic guinea pigs, like the size of rhinoceroses,
mm-hmm.
and they would eat these avocados, and the pit was too strong for their teeth to break it down, and it would pass through them, and then like it would like be fertilized and grow or whatever. And that was like its life cycle. Like it had to be eaten by one of these megafauna really to propagate.
Also, giant sloth. Sorry.
Yeah, giant sloth is another example. Yeah. Giant sloth, and there was like a giant guinea pig. Those were the two big ones. There were bigger like alpacas and things like that too. And then basically, as with all of the world's megafauna, humans came and killed it all off like extremely quickly, because we're like really, really good at hunting large animals. And so, but at the same time, like, and you have to understand that like it only would have taken like 100 years for like avocados to completely go extinct. But at the same time that we moved into that territory and like killed off this reproductive mechanism, we started eating the avocado, and we liked it, and we learned how to farm it and like keep it going. And essentially like it's only because humans enjoy the taste of avocado that it like still exists. Like we rerouted its reproductive process. I
actually love avocados and I've learned this history before. It's absolutely during the Pleistocene area, all the megafauna. Although I've heard there's a few competing theories as to the explanation of why the megafauna went extinct.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a theory pushed by some people that there was a meteor that hit an ocean or something and caused massive flooding, and this caused a lot of the megafauna, especially in North America and other places, to go extinct. But it's open for debate. Yeah, and it was going to be an evolutionary anachronism.
Yeah.
One of these foods that was going to go slowly extinct, and there's a lot of these foods right now in the U.S. that are slowly going extinct because of this process. Like the Osage orange is something that was only eaten by the megafauna, and now it is only existing in low-lying swamps and valleys, and it's just, waiting for the return of the woolly mammoth that's never coming. And I find that very poetically sad in a way.
Totally.
But because obviously tree generations pass so slowly, only a few thousand generations have passed, or a few hundred or whatever. So they're still clinging on in isolated areas.
Yeah.
Even when they're not consumed by humans. But it's great that avocado were taken on and
I know, right?
saved from their fate.
I'm just going to turn the light on. I'm noticing it's pretty dark.
Cool.
Yeah, it's super interesting. The whole process of speciation I found fascinating. I should send you a video. I watched a video this week that blew my mind, where they had I believe the title was mathematical challenges to Darwinian evolution. And it was it's not a religious video at all, but it's mathematicians basically questioning. They're if you really use the estimates of how many organisms there were and how long their lifespans were, and there's this many combinations of DNA, you can kind of develop probabilistic models of how long it would take for species to emerge and stuff like that. And they really dig into their thesis basically is that it's a mathematical impossibility for adaptation, as Darwin looks at it, to explain all of the different speciation on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Super interesting.
So they're saying
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, are they suggesting a separate mechanism than the specific one Darwin explored, group evolution or whatever? I'm not sure.
Yeah, they don't really get into an alternative model, but basically they accept what Darwin really demonstrated that is completely unchallengeable is the finches and stuff, right? Something changing the shape of your beak and stuff like that, over time. These guys are challenging more so the idea that that process accounts for all evolution, all speciation from a single organism or something like that. And that's kind of their proposal. They're not really
Cool.
being God made it all in 8 days or anything. It's more the math doesn't really seem to work. Maybe there's something we're missing. Right.
Yeah. Cool. I mean, I know people have used a similar argument and brought in terms like microevolution and macroevolution.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've always, from a purely philosophical perspective, I liked the argument that any journey can be made with a series of single steps. So by tiny changes, you can eventually unravel into these large ones, but I don't know enough about the process. I'm fascinated with what you're talking about. So I'd be...
Well, I won't do justice, but there's a general idea of it takes a certain amount of time. We won't suddenly have kids who are have 6 arms, right? It takes time for these changes to emerge. And then we have a fairly good timeline of when life was happening, right? We have a fossil record that says this organism came out is the wrong word, but this organism sort of started happening in this era and lasted for this long. And they're applying these mathematical models there to be could it really could random adaptation have happened on a big enough scale to really change it this much in this time period?
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty wild.
Sweet. Yeah. I remember back in the day, I definitely think that theory of evolution is beautiful. And I love, there's lots of just the classic books by I guess I did do, I did read at least one, the Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins. I think that's what it's called. Yeah, it talks about how the eye has evolved at several different points in evolutionary history, and it's a predictable series of events that cause it to emerge. And it wasn't just one eye that emerged back in the day that we all came from. It's they keep on popping up from scratch, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
And as something that's thought of as being so complex and impossible to.
Richard Dawkins' science is actually really cool. I feel it's unfortunate that he's now known as the weird atheist guy,
Yeah,
Or
totally.
like his actual stuff. Like he's the one who developed like memetics too. Like the word meme comes from
Yeah.
Dawkins and this idea that like ideas propagate the same way that organisms do, and they evolve, and there's a survival of the fittest and things like that. It's
Yeah,
super fascinating.
absolutely. And I think that's so accurate, where
Totally.
ideology spreads based on the fitness of its ability to spread. And yeah, it's funny how that has changed into like what we know as memes, which is
Yeah.
like vaguely, I mean, it's referencing this same similar thing, but it's like,
Memes are like a really interesting thing. Like if you think about them scientifically, a meme is like a very highly distilled communication of information through something.
yeah.
And it's kind of like a neat idea.
And it's like, I think, lubricated by the process of comedy. Like it's made more spreadable by the fact that it's
Yeah,
like has an element of that's funny. And like, and I think we kind of dismiss it as something serious because of that. But I think that just makes it more effective as a meme using like the Dawkins terminology.
totally. Do you think, I had an argument with a friend of mine about this a couple weeks ago. Do you think that a meme has to be funny? Or like, are there like serious memes like that are still sort of the same thing, but aren't like comedic? Or is like meme as we think of it, like a purely like humorous thing?
Well, I like personally the more Dawkins type explanation where it's something that spreads effectively. So
Yeah.
a meme would be something that's more successful.
Mhm.
And that's going to be what I would define it as. But I can see how the more modern version would be something that has to be funny.
Yeah, I
But
agree. Like, I think that it doesn't have to be funny.
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. I would yeah. Any what else is?
Do you need another wood thing? Is that what?
I need a wood-based prompt. Yeah,
I'm not sure I have another wood thing. I shouldn't have used the fire one so quickly.
that's okay. I I do really want to do eventually a book a video on, well, probably lots of the books I've been reading on Native American culture, but especially on 1491. I'm going to reread
Yeah.
that one because it has such cool information in that book.
Did you know that syphilis came back to Europe from the Americas? Or at least the prominent theory is that like the first settlers of the Americas brought syphilis back. So we talk about how like we brought smallpox and it wiped out huge segments of the population, which is absolutely true. But the
Mhm.
inverse also happened during the Columbian Exchange. And in like the 1500s, you start to see like these huge epidemics of syphilis where hundreds of thousands of people are dying from it in Europe. And
I,
it's like interesting.
yeah,
I know people don't know that, but yeah, there is no syphilis until like 1500 with like there's a war between Italy and France, I believe, where they had like these massive outbreaks of syphilis and tons of people died. And like they
interesting.
theorized that it came to Italy from the New World.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I mean, cool in the sense that that's interesting, also horrifying, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, and I think
I'm
because like generally like Native American societies were more like uh should we say sexually free than like European societies or whatever, like they were
definitely certain.
probably able
Yeah,
to develop herd immunity, whereas that like still hasn't happened here.
yeah, yeah. No, it's definitely true for certain. I guess I don't know enough about the diversity of European societies, but I
Yeah.
definitely
I'm
true for
sure.
certain ones that they're very sexually pious and restrictive.
Wow, yeah. Certainly more so than the Americas. Like obviously it was never as pious as it claims to be, but
Yeah,
by virtue of the fact that there was an epidemic of syphilis about 30 years after like 100 people brought it back.
yeah,
You can
absolutely.
imagine like those guys, they're like, they've just been to America. Like they're gonna come back and like fucking spread it like wildfire. Like any pub in Italy, you could get laid,
Yeah,
I'm sure.
yeah. You're a world adventurer. You would travel to a different
It would
land.
be like if today you were like, I've been to Mars. Like,
Yeah, you're literally an astronaut. I was. That's exactly what that is. That's a perfect analogy. You're from a different world. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
there's this great. Do you ever listen to Norm Macdonald? Are you familiar with him? The Canadian.
My roommate loves Norm Macdonald, and I've become quite a big fan through him over the last year and a bit.
Oh yeah.
So, yeah.
There's this great bit. I'm not going to remember, but he's talking about like the eighth man who landed on the moon, and it's some guy you've never heard of. And he's like, this guy must be sitting at home being like, what the fuck do I have to do to get famous? Like, like,
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, it's still pretty amazing. You'd think we would know his name, but
isn't it weird?
that's,
Like, there's only maybe 15 people who have walked on the moon, and we can't name like more than 3, probably.
I can't name more than 2.
I can name Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong. Yeah, there's a third guy that went with them. I can't even name him.
There you go. We're in the same camp. Yeah, no, they. Well, it's definitely the kind of thing where there's certain people that are just, for whatever reason, our media and just the narrative of society decides that they're worth remembering or knowing, and then even though there's like the guy who invented the new type of seed that made food prices in India and all these places like drop by a huge percentage and prevented the massive famines that were going to strike. I don't know his name.
Right.
Do that geoengineering, or not geoengineering, the that term of genetically modifying organisms. He did that in a way that was incredibly beneficial to millions
I
upon
think
millions of people.
probably the scientists don't want their names attached to that work because they know that it's like extremely controversial. Like,
I
you don't want to
suppose.
be the guy who invented like the world's most popular GMO food because people will like, as much as like I'm sure both of us are like pro GMO, like there are certainly people who are militantly against it.
Yeah, I definitely know a lot of them. I actually went to a talk when I was like 22, and my friend brought me to a talk in like a community center, and like they put a video on the screen of like all this terrifying GMO or anti-GMO propaganda, and then we had like a talk afterwards. So I remember very vividly just being very caught up in the anti-GMO movement. I thought it was
Yeah.
poison and causing cancer, all these things.
What I find really interesting, and I always wonder if there's some intent behind this, is like, so like the anti-GMO conversation tends to be focused in what I would term like a pseudoscientific idea that like GMO foods will be harmful to humans or that they're not tested enough or whatever. But I think, and then you get like the pro GMO people that are like, look at all the good it's doing. But like the actual evil of GMO, in my opinion, is that it's like corporatizing this whole thing. Like it's creating this feedback loop where farmers have to buy seeds every year and like
Yeah.
you're not allowed to resow your crop. Some of the seeds aren't even viable after one generation. And
And see,
like
that's, yeah.
companies like Monsanto are like monopolizing like farming essentially through the use of GMOs. But nobody is ever talking about that. It's always like, oh, like this fucking tomato is going to have eyeballs on it.
That's the thing. Oh man, thank you for bringing some nuance to that
Yes.
brilliantly pro GMO point. But yeah, there's always like a rational conversation that could be happening that's over here, and it's like this is the thing that people are raving about. It's like we have to address these points that are so not even worth talking about. We could have a real conversation about the issues with like essentially planned obsolescence. And
But like yeah, I think, yeah, I guess it is like planned obsolescence in some sense. But like I always wonder if that's like done intentionally. Like I don't think
right?
Monsanto really cares about like the bullshit bad press, but if like you can concoct a cartoonified like criticism of what you're doing, it's almost better for you than like no criticism at all.
Yeah, I would say that I think if that was done intentionally, it's a very intelligent strategy.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
There's a movie, I'm never gonna find the name of it. I watched it on an airplane, but it's about like it's Matt Damon, and he goes into like this small town and he's sent to like convince them to sign off on like fracking essentially. And
Mhm.
there's like this, I'm gonna give the whole movie away, so I hope you're not like extremely invested already. But there's like this environmentalist there who's like leading a grassroots movement against him and keeps like,
Is she really attractive?
no, I think it's two
That's-
dudes, I'm not sure.
Sorry, go on. Never mind.
But like yeah, I saw it, like I said, I saw it on an airplane years ago. But like this environmentalist is like trying to undermine him or whatever, and like they're fighting against each other the whole time. And then like right at the end of the movie, there's like some scandal with the environmentalist where he's caught with like a prostitute or something, and it like kills the whole discussion. And then like the fracking bill goes through, and then you find out at the very end that the environmentalist was also hired by the oil company to like go there, and he was part of like the whole media strategy that
Yeah.
they'll have like a, you know, have a messiah of the anti-movement and undermine him, and then like
Yeah, absolutely. I think that kind of thing happens all the time where you have the controlled opposition and you have, yeah, I don't doubt it. Obviously, it can
It's
kind
more
of,
conspiratorial, but
yeah, sometimes it's not a lot of use in kind of exploring possibilities, but I mean, why wouldn't they? I mean, we have
yeah.
evidence of it happening in certain isolated instances, and yeah.
Hmm. What else? I've been watching The Boys on Amazon Prime. It's so good.
Yeah, I've wanted to check that out. I have access to it, but I have not watched it yet. So
It's pretty sweet.
sweet.
It's very like the state goes too far, like what happens to the little guy kind of thing. It's really
Okay, I might enjoy that.
yeah. No. Like I finally caved and got Prime, and like I wish I'd got it like so long ago. Like I've never
Like,
had Amazon Prime, but
and they have Shutter on that too, right? Is that part of that one?
maybe. Prime does like this weird thing. I don't fully understand it, where like you buy Prime and then like through Prime you can buy like they have like channels. So like you could pay extra and get like Acorn TV, which is like all these like British soap operas and shit. Or you could buy like this other package, or you can get like HBO, for example. And so I don't really understand if that's like just Prime has exclusive access to those things, or like you can just use Prime as like the conduit through which you buy like another service. Like,
Yeah, I don't know. Because I know Shutter often advertises itself as an independent
yeah,
outlet, or whatever you call it. But yeah, that's through. I'm pretty sure it's through Prime. My roommate has that one as well. That's got a wealth of bad horror movies if you're into that sort of thing.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. What do
What's
you?
been like?
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask, what is like another big thing you've seen on Prime that's sold you on the experience?
I watched Guava Island, which is like the Donald Glover movie that like This Is America is from and everything.
Mm-hmm.
It was pretty good.
Yeah, my coworker was trying to get me to watch that.
There's a couple that I've watched like at friends' houses before. Like I watched Good Omens, which I thought was really good. I'm gonna watch The Man in the High Castle. That's supposed to be really good.
Yeah, sweet.
Yeah.
Philip K. Dick.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. I felt like, I guess like in some sense, I felt like I didn't want to support Amazon because like I really think like Amazon is not a great model for how our society should be working, but you have some good fucking services.
Are you saying in general the idea of online purchasing you think is
Not really like the concept of online purchasing, but like a lot of Amazon's like business practices are like fairly predatory, and I would say that like just these general models of like they don't pay taxes, they like post losses every year, like a lot of, and this isn't unique to Amazon, but a lot of internet companies are running on like sort of like bubbles of like popular interest where they never turn a profit, but they continue to grow because people just like think they're a good idea or whatever. Like Netflix is the same way. Like Netflix hasn't had a profitable year in like 15 years, but like their stock price continues to soar because like people want to own Netflix stock.
I got to think that Amazon's ability to not turn a profit and in turn not pay taxes is due to some sort of fancy bookkeeping or something, right? Because aren't they doing really well? They're not turning a profit.
But like this is like the thing, like all of basically like the model a lot of these companies are running on is just that they reinvest everything into like growth, which is a way of like, in the best possible viewing of that, you could say that like they're really believe in their service and that they want to expand it and bring us more people. The more diabolical side of that would be that they don't want to pay any taxes, and not making any money is an easy way to do that. But how they really get all of their money is that like wealthy people like the Warren Buffetts of the world say like, I want to own like a $500 million chunk of Amazon, and they'll buy a whole bunch of stock that like is almost unquestionably overvalued because they're not delivering that kind of profit margin to like really justify their valuation. So
totally,
it's pretty much exactly what was happening in the .com bubble before it popped and everyone went bankrupt. So like, yeah.
Okay. And I guess you mentioned during our union conversation about how they tend to prevent the formation of collective bargaining in very sneaky ways. So I did forget about that. There's that
They're
as well.
very, very anti-union, which is always like, I'm always highly critical of that when I see that in like a corporate setting, because like when I see like people, everyday people who are against unions, I'm like, they're probably, and I guess this is like a very condescending way of looking at it, but probably they aren't very educated on how unions work. Like when I see working class people who are against unions, it's usually for like the cartoonish talking points that like aren't really true.
Mm-hmm.
But like when I see Jeff Bezos being critical of unions, it's hard for me to believe it's that. I think he has like probably an entire section of his company devoted to researching union practices and things like that. And he's presenting a narrative that he wants people to buy into.
Totally, and especially if you're against like voluntary unions that aren't connected to a monopoly or government, that seems very suspicious and just kind of
like any effort to like
bad.
prevent employees from organizing is like usually a pretty bad look. Like
Yeah,
Walmart is
definitely.
pretty bad for that too. Like it's not just Amazon, but yeah, like anytime you're like, oh, like everyone at the Des Moines like Amazon facility just got fired overnight because some of them were trying to start a union. Like,
Yeah,
fucking, yeah.
yeah, definitely have been argued to the position by you that I think we need to have laws that protect employees if they want to organize unions.
Yeah.
And
Just
rather
to
than
make like an even playing field where like often I think the free market sometimes needs like a hand. Like that's kind of what I believe in. Like talking to you a lot about like free marketism. Like I am really sold on the benefits of the free market and how like it. There's a video I watched the other day where they said like it really like brings computing power to the table in like an interesting way.
yeah,
A centralized government will only have so many brains and so many computers like trying to plan the economy, whereas like in the United States you have like 100,000 business owners like all doing little calculations, and like this distributed model comes with better outcomes.
and just the
But
price mechanism.
yeah, like well, everything from price mechanisms to like resource allocation, like all these problems get solved because there's so many more people solving them.
Totally.
But I also think that sometimes the free market, I don't like drink the Kool-Aid and think that the free market is like this perfect thing that always delivers the best answer. I think that sometimes the role of government can be to help the, if the goal is ultimately to have the market deliver these good outcomes, which I think it is, sometimes you need a helping hand from the government to make that happen.
Yeah, and I the way they put it in a recent book that I was reading is that in theory, an interaction between someone buying a product and someone selling it should encompass, like the price of the product should encompass all of the costs of it. But if the cost is distributed to people in general across society in the form of negative externalities, then you're not actually paying for all of the cost.
Yeah.
And just having laws in place that through which the free market operates, I think is important. And personally, I think those laws should be an emergent thing based on kind of a cultural consensus that we people as a group come together and realize that we need to have a precedent that says that employees have the right to organize, for instance. But yeah, it's absolutely true that we need these laws, this framework through which this can operate.
For sure.
And whether or not you would call those laws an extension of the free market, as I probably would, and then it gets very amorphous and confusing, or whether or not those laws are coordinated from a centralized institution. Is
like I would almost say like I am a big supporter of a productive market, and it isn't always like a completely free market, although perhaps it generally is. Like again, like you said, with like emissions or things like that, like there are like well documented failures of the free market that have been studied for centuries that it needs help with.
Yeah, and I think with the case of especially pollution, I think that's the best case for an institution outside of the free market putting in place rules and standards that prevent the exploitation of people outside the system. But yeah,
yes,
it becomes so complicated, especially with terminology when you start using terms like laws, because lots of free market theorists like David Friedman believe in laws, but they believe laws should be an expression of market forces. So it becomes very confusing to talk about.
Like I've read stuff like that too, but don't you think that's kind of like a non-answer? Like you're like, yeah, like we'll have a free market of laws and like it'll always give us the right answers. And you're like, well, how? And then I've never really heard it explained how that will actually work. Like,
Yeah, well, I think,
how will it not
and
just pick the same things the free market is already picking? Which is like
yeah,
laws that defend these big corporations that exert a lot of control in the market.
yeah, and as I said, I do think that um, an argument could be made that a type of institution like that is operating on laws outside of the market, an argument can be made that that should intervene in the case of things like wide-scale pollution.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and in that case, that wouldn't be the market.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think that there are lots of cases where laws can emerge in a very functional way within the market. And I think just like insurance companies are a good example where they have established ways of resolving disputes before they even plan to engage with people, or before they even engage with the people. But yeah, it's I think laws, I think I think there's like three different categories of problems for the market to solve. The easiest problem in my mind is how will the market provide basic services like food, healthcare, education. And I think that that's a very straightforward question to answer. And I think it's very easy to make the case. The more difficult problem is like the problem of like how will the market provide laws and standards, practice, and where people use the same USB to plug in their phone, so it's not like just things like that.
Yeah.
And the third problem is pollution. And I think the pollution one is the most difficult. I think there are certain types of pollution problems that the market cannot solve. I think there's certain pollution problems the market is more suited to solve. But I think those, in my mind, those are the three tiers of problems. And I'm not convinced that the market can solve all pollution problems. I do think they can generally solve most legal problems, except not the legal problems that pertain to pollution. So it's like, they're related. But
I agree with that. I think I would say there are like more problems. Like I might, for example, like healthcare you stated, like I think there's a lot of reading you could do that shows that like the free market is a poor deliverer of healthcare outcomes. Like and education is a little bit more hotly debated right now, but there's some evidence that the free market doesn't always deliver good results there either. I think my general opinion is that like the free market is extremely good, and I would actually say like unequivocally that real one-on-one trades are litigated by the free market better than any other system. Like when it's really, I need a boat and this guy's selling a boat and like we can figure that out. The market does that very well. The market model doesn't handle these issues that have large numbers of stakeholders because the like complexity gets too big for the two people making the deal to really like handle. And the incentives aren't there for like third-party stakeholders to be like really considered properly in those decisions. So like pollution is the biggest one because we're all stakeholders.
yeah.
But even like more basic ones like labor and stuff like that, where you have like more factors than just two people trying to do a deal, like the market doesn't do that computing very well, in my opinion.
I would say that I agree that with respect to education and healthcare, the market doesn't always come up with the best solution. But I think even if the market more often than not comes up with the best solution, that's good enough. And I do think that that's the case in that when looking at things like healthcare, what's presented by a kind of free negotiation process is better and more functional than government monopoly. But
so like
certainly,
are you familiar with the idea of like inelastic demand? Like
yeah, where
economic concept. Yeah. So like that's why I would say that healthcare, that's one of two reasons I would say healthcare is handled poorly by the market. Like the sort of well-documented thing that's happening in the United States is you get runaway costs because like people don't really have a choice. Like you need a product, and so you're at a disadvantage in negotiating with a company to get that product because you will die if you don't get it, right? You don't really have, and I'd argue labor suffers from the same problem, that there isn't really this like walk away option from that deal. Like you need, at some point you need to get your insulin, and sure, you might have a couple companies to choose from, but like because that demand is so fixed, it doesn't really function very well as like a free market. And it's also like prohibitively difficult to deliver healthcare. There's a ton of barriers to entry. Like we wouldn't even allow legally, but even if we did, it would be very difficult for someone to open a surgery in their garage and like treat people. Like you need billion-dollar pieces of equipment. You need like years of training. It needs to be sanitary, sterile. Like you need to be reviewed. Like it's very difficult. It's not a very competitive market space, I guess. Is like.
Yeah, well, I think a big part of why that's the case is because there's so many barriers to entry, things like the AMA, the American Medical Association, and other essentially government hurdles that create cartels that jack up the price to absurd levels in the States. And I know there's I think it's like the Oklahoma Surgery Center. They're a center in the States that they basically have stepped outside of the insurance system and have through some government loophole, they found a way to provide healthcare essentially outside the system, but they still have government oversight and obviously they're doing things in a safe way. But they, for instance, like to rent a room for surgery is normally like thousands and thousands of dollars a day, and they just do it for like a few hundred. So they've cut costs like down to like absurd levels. And yeah, I think, and in terms of you needing a service and therefore it being a different case, I think there are lots of things like food, that food is necessary for survival, but having a large competitive marketplace where there's lots of solutions being offered and a big bidding war is what's going to create the most effective service anyway, despite the necessity of the service. And I don't know if you're familiar with like the history of like fraternal societies. I know I've read
like Freemasons and stuff like that?
Yeah, what eventually evolved into Freemasons and secret societies. But traditionally, they used to provide a lot of the healthcare and social safety nets to societies. I know in Britain, Canada, Australia, and US, up to 40% of the population was part of these societies. And then eventually, they outlawed the provision of healthcare through these societies. And in Britain, the explicit reason for outlawing the provision of healthcare was that they were dragging the good name of doctors through the mud by requiring them to provide healthcare at such a low cost, because these fraternal societies that were usually like based in religions or ethnicities or whatever else, they would provide healthcare at such a low cost that the doctors were kind of like, if they wanted to do the profession, they had to, they weren't getting the respect they felt they deserved. And so they lobbied the government for essentially monopoly privilege. And that was the AMA, that was the forming of that prevented these fraternal societies to operate. And I know Roderick T. Long, while he's a libertarian socialist and very left-wing and very in favor of like government healthcare in a sense, he writes some great history about how these institutions were very functional. And so I tend to look at them as a good example of how they could exist in the past, but obviously with different types of safety regulations because we live in a different time. But back in the day, apparently it was like a day's labor for a year's worth of healthcare. And obviously a different world, different technology, but I'm a fan of that kind of thing, personally.
I'd be very interested to read about it. I've honestly never even like heard of that. So like that's an interesting idea.
He wrote like a very short paper called How Government Solved the Healthcare Crisis. And it was about how, the healthcare crisis was doctors not being paid enough, and they solved it by ending fraternal society provision of healthcare. And that's like a 2-page paper, but he's great about that.
Mm-hmm. I think a major, just the way the patents work in healthcare is probably the most major challenge to like really having good healthcare. Like the fact and they're being like systemically, intentionally, the patent system is being systemically and intentionally abused by these companies. They make incremental changes so they can renew their patents for 10 more years and things like that. Like countries that really go to war against that and shut it down, see very good healthcare outcomes.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm against the whole patenting system in principle.
Do you think in general there should just be no patents?
I've kind of been argued to the point where I kind of disagree with all intellectual property in general. I think if you want, there's lots of people that like coders, for instance, that put a lot of work into what they're doing. It's not even really art. They're doing like a trade, and what they're producing is absolutely, they should be compensated. But I think you can have lots of security features in place, like even USB locks and things like that to protect against privacy. So I'm kind of more for those kind of market solutions to protect trade secrets and information. But I don't support IP in general now. So that's my way of getting around the whole patent issue. I absolutely agree, and let's just tear it all down.
Yeah, just interesting. If I could challenge you on that,
Cool.
do you think, and maybe this is an acceptable loss, but do you think that in removing intellectual property rights, you disincentivize the creation of new technologies?
I think you do.
Okay.
I do also think that there's a lot of the most important developments and growth happens because just inspired individuals are fighting for a new advancement in technology. And so I don't think it stops it, but I do think that there will absolutely be art and technology and work that is not done because there's no financial incentive. But
interesting. I tend to be, as somebody who's very pro technology, will solve all the world's problems. I want to say explicitly, I don't think the patent system that we have now works at all, because what it really does is lets these huge companies control the space, which is the worst possible outcome. It doesn't really benefit the actual inventors and creators. And in fact, many of the most famous inventors in history, like Eli Whitney and Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison, spent their lifetimes fighting in court to maintain their right to their own ideas, and a lot of them died broke as a result. It's very I don't know, it doesn't work, but I'm not sure that I'm sympathetic to the idea that we should remove the current system. I'm not sure that having no ownership of ideas whatsoever is the right answer, I guess.
And if there certainly could be a much more functional version of the system that somehow accommodates people's, allows people to exchange ideas and adopt new ideas without having these crazy barriers, but still compensates people for what they create and what they, in a sense, own. I'm very open to the idea that it could exist, but at this point in time, there's a guy on Facebook that I follow named Stephen Kinsella. He's a lawyer, and he argues very compellingly in favor of the abolishment of all of this. So he's kind of won me over, but I'm also kind of not quite sure.
If I could I'm just thinking right now, because I've never really thought about this, but I guess what I would really advocate for is something like the tenure system. Rather than really giving you ownership of an idea, say if you prove yourself as an inventor, we'll allow you, or if you're a brilliant scientist or a writer or whatever, have this idea of patronage where we just give those people the resources to and a lot of Archimedes is my personal hero, and that's exactly what he was. They just gave him money and he invented shit for something to do. But if you give people no compensation, they won't be able to do that as much, because they have to work a job then to survive, right? Whereas
absolutely.
Making those resources available, you can say, okay, here's $100K a year, fucking do stuff.
Yeah, even if they're doing it for all the right reasons and they're purely passionate, they might not be able to if they, as you say, they're required to survive in other ways. And I love that idea. They could even do a thing where big corporations could sponsor some plucky inventor, and they could have Exxon Mobil, on their shirt when they go to the press conference, or whatever we have to do in order to make it work. But
we used to do a lot of that in our society. If you look at the Manhattan Project, for example, that was okay, we're going to take the 30 most brilliant scientific minds in America and give them unlimited amounts of money to do science. And we had a huge leap forward in science. The end result was a nuclear weapon, which is probably not the perfect outcome of a peaceful society, but just the idea that I think it's a proof of concept that if you try that, it really did work better than how anyone else was doing it.
Good science was produced. Yeah. So even if you disagree with the type of science, yeah, it was.
Yeah, there's a guy, I can't think of his name. He's like a famous economist, and he was like one of the first ones to do like computerized investing, and he made like $1 gazillion. He's like James Maynard, maybe. Um, anyway, before he became like a gazillionaire doing the market, he worked in like a place like that. Like basically the government like paid him to just like work, and like once a month you'd meet with somebody and like explain like this is the mathematics I've been working on and stuff like that. And like those always seem like just like, I don't know, the right way to do science. Like,
I love that. Yeah.
yeah, remove it from the system. I don't think science belongs in like the market, really. Like we just as a society need to see it as an objective good and make the resources available to like do it.
Yeah, and just as it would be a great just PR stunt for any rich individual or
Totally.
business to just prop up what we know as in generally as society is like an important.
And when you go that way, like, you know, a patron, like patron of the arts, for example, or whatever, like they will have the resources also, like they provide a service to those like creative minds as well, I think. Because like if you're, and vice versa. So like if you're inventing like the next light bulb or whatever, like sure, you might not necessarily have a patent or whatever, but like that billionaire has the resources to like make money off of that before people copy it and stuff like that, right? Like,
Yeah,
there's always an inherent financial incentive to just be, if you have the resources to utilize, like to realize your ideas, there's
that's
always
the
an
thing.
advantage to being first.
And that's always the problem with lots of people who are famous inventors, so that they don't have the resources to
Exactly.
bring their ideas to fruition. So they're often just a pawn of a massive corporation that's never given credit or remembered by history or financially compensated.
Absolutely. Something I think like my quick like $1 fix for the current system would just be to make patents non-transferable.
No, what, sorry?
Non-transferable. So like
Right.
you can't sell your patent to a company, you can't pass it down to your kids. Like for your lifetime, you are owed a royalty on that patent because you own the idea, and companies can't circumvent that by making patent factories in their basement and stuff like that. But like,
Right.
you know, that gives you that in our current system, it wouldn't fix everything, but it would at least mean that the
It
right
would solve a
people are
lot.
compensated. Yeah.
Just the fact that patent factories wouldn't be a thing would be, I think, a huge, huge thing.
Yeah. Like if you look at like patent trolls and stuff, like that's like probably the worst aspect of the current system. And
Exactly, yeah.
yeah,
And,
like most things, it's like deeply corrupted and very difficult to like salvage. Like,
yeah, but it is good that I think patent trolls and similar people, they bring out the flaws in the current system that exist and kind of show us what needs to be fixed. If I can be very optimistic and,
like sometimes you need like abusers, like in coding, for example, like you often talk about how like you need like hackers to find the bugs that like you wouldn't find yourself, right? Like,
yeah,
and oftentimes like companies actually hire like people who make like viruses and things like that will then get hired by like McAfee, and they'll be like, okay, like help us like do this. Like, what was your process to find these exploits and things like that? Like,
yeah, reveal the leaks in our system kind of thing.
yeah, exactly. They're the secret shoppers, you know, like.
Yeah. Yeah, that's sweet.
Yeah. Okay, I think it's your turn for a random topic.
Wood, market forces, IP.
Yeah.
What's the next natural line of exploration of conversation?
Are there any like ideas that you've been kind of thinking you'd want to do like a full episode on, that you want to sort of like dip your toe in the waters? Like,
well, I want to talk about.
I'm gonna do a 3-part episode on wood. So like.
I just love the idea of you being like, just always bringing the conversation back to wood somehow. And just, that reminds me of the great wood scholar, Benjamin D. Thornton.
I don't know. It's such a like, it's weird when you think that like in the like entirety of the universe, wood is an exceptionally rare material. Like of materials you would ever even think of like using en masse, like, you never like wood is so rare compared to like diamonds, for example. Like
It's true that like relative to any of the other easily manufactured, because it obviously necessarily is manufactured by a multi-billion year process, it's much more unique than
yeah,
any of the other things that are fashioned with.
totally.
Okay, well, I think I definitely want to do a video on like, there's a conversation on like Native American rights traditionally and the whole conflict that happened. And I want to talk like some history about that a little bit. And I want to do a video talking about how there's not like Native American culture. There's a crazy diversity
Yes.
in Native American cultures that like they have, there's not like one way in which they did something. They did things every way. And try to focus on some of the differences that I've tried to learn about and between
Yeah.
different tribes.
I think it's sad like how we homogenize it, like especially in media. Like you just have like this generic idea of like, oh yeah, like they lived in teepees, they put feathers in their hair, like that's what they all did. Like unless
Yeah.
you go farther south enough, and then they built pyramids and covered everything in gold. Like those like
Yeah, like one that comes to mind is that there's a famous meeting between the first French and British people who came to New England, and they met the Iroquois Nation population. And the Iroquois Nation were all very tall and proud people, and they had very ornately done hair with like the sides shaven and mohawks and ponytails and piercings and all these like beautiful adornments. And the population of Westerners that came were often from religions that prohibited any kind of self-idolation, and they saw and many of the people had never had a bath in their entire life, and their interaction with the Iroquois Nation was a crazy contrast and very contrary to how we often view the savages of North America. We see them as the people who never bathed, and so one could view Native Americans as being that way. But then if you look at the Comanche tribe, Comanches literally lived in dirt. They had very few adornments. They were like very squat. They looked like jockeys, which made them very natural horse riders. So they were like very different in look. So, one can contrast the Iroquois Nation with the British settlers, but you can also contrast that with, it's not like that's what Native Americans looked like. And I think I've seen lots of narratives that present Native Americans as just being the Iroquois Nation, like as if that's what they were all like, these like proud, beautifully adorned, but that's just one group. And
do you think in some ways like Christianity was really the technology that allowed us to colonize the world? Like I don't think we really could have done it without like the Christian underpinnings of like we're going over there to like civilize these savage peoples, and like realistically like non-Christian societies didn't do colonies, like, and like so much of the pro-colonist writing is like deeply fundamentally Christian. The people who came to America in particular, but anywhere like South Africa, whatever, came there because of their like devoutly held religious beliefs. Like I don't know, I just had that.
yeah,
What do you think?
well, I think I'd have two thoughts. I do think that Christianity enabled a lot of like huge moral revolutions and shifts in culture and society. And I do think religious sensibilities probably incentivize conquest or create, the factors that would enable that much more than other things. But I think there are lots of imperialist nations that weren't necessarily Christian. I think even Comanche Native Americans were very imperialistic. They took over all the plains with Kiowa troops. And so, I kind of agree with you, but I also, I would like to do a video on how Christianity played a role in certain things like the end of slavery. And I think that as someone who used to be very just anti-religious in general, it's something that I've been forced to reconcile in my philosophy, to recognize that religion has played a very interesting and important part in the development of human beings and in the development of our treasured moral, our moral victories that we've achieved very recently.
Mm-hmm. I tend to believe, like, if you go throughout history, often the justification by which we like depose kings or like oppose despots and things like that is a religious one. Like, and like religion throughout history served as this like balancing force against like statism. And we had like two major powers coexisting within a land that like kept each other in check a little bit. And increasingly in the modern era, in the last 100 years, I would say, like the state has begun to like win out over that in most of the world in like a very major way. And I don't think the result has been great necessarily.
Yeah,
Without like picking any religion in particular, I think that's just true everywhere. It's as true in China as it is in America, as it is in like even in places like Iran and stuff. Like you're increasingly seeing like the government outpace the religious authorities.
yeah, I do think that is true, absolutely, in a sense. I would say it's more that there are certain situations in which, however you want to describe it, you enter a situation where there's very dark incentives at work, or there's a market failure, or there's a situation where everyone acting in their own interest is going to just continue to decay and erode and destroy the communal society.
Yeah.
And religions oftentimes have served the function of making people, rise above the immediate rational incentives, because you're putting in place dogma that's fundamentally irrational, but it incentivizes a kind of collective good that wouldn't be possible if people were just acting rationally. And so I think that's almost the function of religion, to counterbalance. And many of these dark incentives are bound up in the state and are empowered by the state. So I think I agree with you in a sense, but I would say it's almost a counterbalance to the cold rationalism that often undermines the formation of very useful social institutions.
Interesting.
I think I agree with you.
The term cold rationalism, like I consider myself to be a rationalist, but I do recognize that often like rationalism has been the driver behind some of like the worst things in history. Like when you remove often down a rational line of thought, you start to remove the human elements or simplify them, and that often leads you to very dark places. Like,
yeah, well, reading this book that's trying to justify the Vietnam War, I think it's a very good example of that, because it pointed out that many of the actions
justify it. Like, are they just like, like Ho Chi Minh is a evil despot, and we were rescuing like the South Vietnamese? Like,
well, it's essentially pointing out that there were very dangerous elements in communism at that time, and how I forget the name, the Viet Cong army, they had a term for them. How like after the war and leading up to the war, they were going on these like raids and where they're killing any dissidents, and there's these massive like horrible programs to just kill anyone who opposed them.
Yeah.
And they pointed out that there are these things happening in lots of societies around the world, and also pointed out that there was this danger of the domino effect, how there's this worry that if Vietnam falls to communism, then other areas in the region will also fall to communism.
Yeah.
And so therefore we should intervene to stop that from happening. And it pointed out that after the war, when US lost, that is in fact exactly what happened, that other countries fell. And it tries to it sells the idea that there's a false dichotomy between either we do nothing and we allow the world to get wrapped up in, inspired by totalitarian ideology, or we go to war with them and we occupy them and we bomb them.
Yeah.
And that's not the only two options. I think we can try to have an information war. We can lead by example. We can, but yeah, that's kind of the crux of because it does this in several ways. It tries to justify also other occupations of Panama and lots of,
How do you justify the occupation of Panama?
It's amazing. Well, you can have a look at it's essentially that, where you give the false idea of you can do absolutely nothing in the situation, or you can
build a canal.
Through like incredible deceptive economic predation, where you like manipulate people with this crazy game of threats and bribes. But it's a wild book. But yeah, it definitely a reminder of how if you follow this kind of dark logic of like, communism is spreading and the only rational thing to do is to like, I don't know. I think there's a context, I think, in which it does make sense if you ignore the fact that that same argument can be used against America. Because obviously like you can point to Ho Chi Minh and other leaders and say, yeah, they had rhetoric that justified violence against America, therefore let's go in. Well, so many American leaders have rhetoric that justifies violence against other places. So, and in innumerable times throughout history, it would be justified by their own logic to invade America. So
I've always found that, like, America in particular has an issue with, so like when America thinks of itself, they don't see themselves as embodied by their president. Like, I really don't think as Americans, like, and this can be seen now more than ever, but even in like the Cold War days, it wasn't like as an American you felt that like Ronald Reagan spoke for you, like just because he was your president. Like, there's this idea of like we're not a homogenous group, like we all have our own opinions and he's just one of us that's been elected. But America doesn't look at any other country in the world like that. Like when they elected Vietnam, like every single person in Vietnam is with this Ho Chi Minh guy, and we have to like stop all of them. And same with Iran, same with Iraq, same with like fucking pick whatever. Like we just like don't give them the same luxury of being like, this is a non-homogenous group that probably has complicated reasons for electing their leadership. Like,
yeah, no kidding. That's that's absolutely true. It's wild how that's never, and I think that's an example of how nationalism props up and enables a very pernicious type of hypocrisy where we're so comfortable not applying the standards to another group that we apply to ourselves because we like, this is us, this is the us group,
and
they're
it's
the
so big,
them group.
like everyone wants to be like this, you know what I mean? Like one of my favorite recent episodes of history is like during the Arab Spring, if you like remember that, Egypt elected the Muslim Brotherhood in like what is largely considered by the international community to be like a fair and just election. They elected like radical Islamists to run their country after we got rid of Mubarak. And like Americans went in and like stopped it and like had another like fraud election where they elected like a more pro-American people. And I was like, man, like just because it must have blown so many people's mind that that's actually what they want. Like, of course they'll elect like progressive Western like leadership. And Iran is like the same thing. Like 30 years before that is like, we have like this propped up like Western democratic leader, and people say, no, actually what we want is like religious law, and like we can pick that for ourselves. Like, but that just boggles the minds of the average American. Like the idea that people want something different.
Yeah, we want you to have democracy, but our democracy. It's like it's such a weird. Not democracy. That's not what you want. You don't want them to have democracy.
In America, if you talk to them about how their government works, everyone thinks it's broken and it's not functioning, and like we have like the worst government, until there's like somebody else trying to do something different, and they're like, "What the fuck are you doing?" Like, two-party democracy is what you should have.
Oh my God, that's so funny. It's true that and it's so many of the same people that are so observant of the broken nature of our own system that are so critical of these other countries and their supposed issues. There's definitely a disconnect there.
It's so weird to me in Western democracies, and I think Canada is almost worse for this than America, but like people are just tolerant of what everyone recognizes as a broken system. Like every single party in Canada is like, we need to reform the Senate. The Canadian Senate is broken. It doesn't do anything. It's a bloated group of like nepotists, basically. Like Harper ran on Senate reform, Trudeau ran on Senate reform, Chrétien ran on Senate reform, and then they just don't like, and we're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, no,
and like it's just weird to me that like that the mechanisms to fix that just seems to be missing. And same in the United States. They're like, this is broken. Like the Senate and the Congress are not working. Like the Electoral College is non-functioning. Like we need to fix this. And then everyone's just like, nah. Like
yeah, I would think there's probably two reasons why that's the case. There's a lot of established momentum where like once you become president or prime minister, you realize how much political momentum there is at play there. And it's probably very difficult to both play the game and to, you know, basically deconstruct the scaffolding on which you're playing the game. It's like kind of a weird thing to do. And also there's just the weird situation of like, I'm sure so many people disagree on what reform needs to happen. Even if everyone agrees that the system is broken, is there really like a huge, like if you look at Occupy Wall Street, everyone knows it's wrong, but nobody agreed on what was wrong, so it all fell apart. And I think that's kind of the it happens again and again. We all know something's wrong, but the momentum peters out because we don't have a clear vision or theory.
See, I'm always a fan of like tear it down first and then decide what you're going to build. Like, because that's where, like, when you talk about like an emergent market for ideas, like that's how you make the emergent market of ideas. There's no emergent market when there's no pressing need, right? Like, that's just going to be a bunch of people sitting around bullshitting about like what they think in a perfect world would work. But like, if you actually say, okay, like this is done, the Senate is axed, like fucking cook something up, like people figure it out.
Yeah, I absolutely. And especially with respect to that, there's not really a crazy, if you have an established authority in place, there wouldn't be like a danger of a balance, like a vacuum of power. So it could be like a,
but even in a power, like that's actually my model. Like when you look at like a full like insurrection, like look at like you know, like Idi Amin or something, where it's just like a complete seizure of the government and you tear down everything that was there before. And it really never, ever takes that long to completely rebuild it. Like in most like coup d'etat, like within a year, you have another fully functioning government with like all the little sections, all the bureaucrats, like fucking whatever. Like, so I struggle for people to be like, fixing the Canadian Senate is a 30-year problem. Like, just fucking do it. Like,
yeah, for sure. And I think obviously the worry is that there are lots of political opportunists waiting in the sidelines, waiting for such an event to take place so that they could sweep in and offer their own justification for their expansion of power or their foothold into the.
But I just think that's part of like, that's the sausage factory, right? Like certainly if you have some of that, like you're probably, your first Senate bill is probably not the best one, but like you got to get the process going. Like,
yeah, for sure. I love that's the sausage factory.
like, yeah, like it's gonna be ugly to watch it happen, and certainly you're gonna see a whole bunch of people be up and like, yeah, like fucking Bombardier should just be the Senate, like, and a whole bunch of like Canadian politicians will stand up and say that's great because they need votes in Quebec. But like eventually you'll get something that works. Or
yeah, for sure.
We don't need it. Like if you remember, I don't know if you're familiar with the story, but when they legalized abortion in Canada. So like the Supreme Court struck down the old law that said like you just could never do it ever. And then they like proposed to the Mulroney government at the time. They're like, okay, like craft a new bill, like make a law. And people just couldn't fucking agree on how it would work, even within the majority like Conservative Party at the time. And then Mulroney basically said, like, I'm going to give you guys one chance to figure it out or else we just won't do it. And they couldn't deliver a bill that everyone could agree on. And so we just don't have a law, like, to this day.
Sweet.
And sometimes that's okay. And it has worked. Like, I'm not going to say that I necessarily agree or disagree with how it functions, but, like, it is functioning. There's not, like, a huge vacuum of, like, oh, like, we really missed this old law. Like, sometimes you can just cut it out and you realize you don't need it anymore.
And that's the thing. So many laws are put in place because of a perceived need and then just never removed, even if they don't perform the function that was intended.
Like, yeah. I would love to, like, every 5 years just go over everything and be like, is this doing anything? Is it functioning? Like, is it necessary? Has it achieved the goal that it wanted to, or has it made it worse? Like, if we did that with drug enforcement, I think we would have put a bullet in it like 30 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you look at the trend of the problem prior to the enforcement of the law and see if it shifted up or down.
Exactly. So if we had a 5-year review, we'd be like, crime is way up, drug use is way up, gangs are way up. Everything is worse than it was 5 years ago. Like, put a bullet in it, it's done.
Also, look at Portugal.
Yeah.
They have like legalized drugs in what, 15 years ago now or something?
Like creative problem solving.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't believe in unsolvable problems. People want to present intractable, unsolvable problems. I don't believe in that. Every problem has a solution by virtue of it being a problem. And you just need to think about it and try things until you come up with a solution that works.
Yeah. And if it's a situation where there are no clear negative externalities, then it's a situation where you can have a market for law, where you can just have like, some people might want to be represented by a Senate or have that regulate or govern aspects of their lives, and some people might be like, nah.
Yeah, like if you look at like drug use, for example, like I am sympathetic to the argument that's like, I don't want a guy shooting up in my front walk or whatever. Like I get that.
Yeah.
I think like a solution, like we don't present it this way, but largely what we've done now is like zones of exclusion. Like the modern policy towards drug use is to concentrate drug users in certain areas And like that does create like slums or whatever, but people just don't go in those areas, and then like other areas are fine, and that works. And
Better.
well, I'm not going to say it's perfect, but I think most people are okay with that, right? Like
I think it's
the concept behind a needle exchange or whatever. Like,
yeah.
Don't have guys shooting up behind 7-Eleven. Have them shoot up here, make it as safe and like easy for them as possible, and minimize what you can there. And then they're not in like the gated communities, like causing problems there. Like
Across the street from schools or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, yeah, go ahead.
Have you seen The Wire?
Yes, I fucking love The Wire. One of
Well,
the
of
best
course,
shows of all time.
I think I struggle to think of a better show unless you're thinking of a very different category. But yeah, they have the example in that show. I forget what it's called, but
they have like Amsterdam or whatever, don't they?
Yes, they call it something, but
yeah,
it's the area where the cops don't enforce
yeah
the law essentially around drugs, and it's a very functional short-term solution until it's discovered in the show and they end that. But
a story that I tell everyone. Do you know where Memorial Park is, like downtown?
I do.
So like Memorial Park used to be a complete fucking shithole full of like drug addicts and everything. And then they built a needle exchange across the street, and it's just fixed. It's normal now. And in fact, because you can exchange needles for drugs there, all of the addicts cleaned up the park. All of the needles and shit are gone now. And it's a much nicer place. And I think that's like the perfect model of like take people out of these places, give them a place that works better for them. They don't want to shoot up outside at a bus stop. Like give them like a nicer place where they can do their thing. Give us like nicer places where you can sit on a bench and not get stabbed, and like everybody benefits. Like, and you're not wasting gazillions of dollars on fucking tanks for your police so that they can fight against gangs. Like,
exactly. You can take down troublesome drug dealers with their tanks. I think that's absolutely a positive shift away from where we're trying to like force people into a certain lifestyle, and just accepting that this is where people are at. Let's meet them where they are at and try to, create a balance between different elements of society.
We tend to, with a lot of issues, moralize them in a way that just allows us to not have a solution. Like we moralize drug use to be like, doing drugs is wrong, so who gives a shit about people who do drugs? Like if they want like better outcomes, like they shouldn't do drugs, and then they are the cause of the problem. Whereas if we see it as like just a thing, like if you look at like, oh, like wet wipes are too expensive, we don't moralize that issue. We just like allocate resources and solve it and make wet wipes cheaper. And if we look at things like that way, rather than looking at them as right and wrong issues, I think they become solvable.
I think they're much easier to approach. I think why the temptation for drug dealers or drug users is to moralize it is because we assume it's a product of a choice. And I think there's a lot of good arguments to be made that a lot of the choices that drug users make are because they're responding to unprocessed early childhood trauma. I know Gabor Mate does a lot of research into people in those injection assistance clinics. What they're called. People who go to those, like almost all of them have been sexually abused and are dealing with unprocessed trauma. And rather than view them as just people who are choosing to live lifestyles that involve maybe stealing or robbing, there are people who are, victims who are struggling with mental health issues that solve them in very imperfect ways with drugs. And we approach it with a lot more empathy, because I do think there are situations in which it makes sense to moralize crimes or issues because of the choices that are made. Maybe it would be more accurate to see them as a force of nature, like criminals, but I don't know. I still struggle with that and the whole idea of free will and responsibility.
I don't know if there's a lot about, like, we certainly recognize that there are like bad things in our society that are not criminal. Like you're allowed to go and like call somebody an asshole in the middle of the street, and like that's bad. That doesn't serve everyone. It's completely destructive. But like you can do that, and nobody thinks that should be a crime. But somewhere we draw like a line where we're like, these things, and sometimes they're not even like as bad as like completely legal things, but we like stop looking at them as just like bad behavior and look at them as like criminal. And I'm not sure that, I think if we took a more holistic approach of just trying to like help people be better, like in a general way, I think it would be better.
Do you think it makes sense to, and I absolutely agree with this line of thinking in general. I still struggle with a bit of the other side. Where do you think that it's useful to moralize somebody who just straight up like sexually assaults people? Or that's an easy example.
Like, should that be like criminalized? Is your question?
Well, certainly, I think we both agree that it'd be criminalized. But do you think it should be moralized in the same way that drug users or drug dealers are?
I
Or
guess like
should
what
it
I
be?
would put to you is that exact, and I'm not at all trying to say that like it forgives what they do, but like what we've come to understand when you study crime is that it is like cycles. Like people,
Mm-hmm.
nobody is out. The old cartoony idea that like I'm just like a rapey rapist who loves to have like that's not a real thing. Like it's people who are damaged. Oftentimes the perpetrators of sexual assault were themselves sexually assaulted. Like you know, many like adult pedophiles were abused as children. Like, and recognizing it more as like a problem than like a crime. Pedophilia, I think, is like the best example of this, because like when you look at like pedophiles, like nobody is like this whole idea of like I'm just a creepy guy with a van who likes to touch kids. Like that's not what it is. It's like a complicated mental health issue. But when we make it into like pedophiles can eat shit, like I don't want people like that in my society, it becomes like a needlessly difficult issue. Like whereas if we just looked at it as like we need to help fix these people, I think that's like a better approach. Like rehabilitate people rather than like punishing them, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very inclined to agree where there's a huge temptation to see certain people are responsible for their choices because they just, somehow stepped outside of their trauma or stepped outside of their history and just chose to do something. But certain people, well, they're just a product of their environment and their history, and they're just, caught in the momentum of the stream. And I think it's always the case that people who are struggling with trauma, or the people who would commit these crimes or these predatory acts, they're struggling with trauma and they're just not dealing with it very well. And so I'm very sympathetic to the idea that applying choice to certain people and not to others is a bit of we have to draw the line arbitrarily at some point.
We should look at criminals as something that we are creating as a society rather than something that people are choosing to do. We should say, why is our society making thieves? Why is our society making rapists? And when you start to look at it that way, I think you can solve it much better. Whereas like, if you're just saying like, there's an incentive structure here that's making people steal, and we'll just try to like, band-aid together a negative incentive on the other end that'll stop them from doing it. I just don't think that works. Like it's a very blunt solution to a very sophisticated problem.
I think it probably works, but never to the degree that never to the degree that actually approaching the source of the problem and addressing that would. Like if we try to end obviously some exposure to early childhood trauma and violence is going to happen, but if we try to minimize that and promote peaceful parenting practices and things like that, then
why does it have to happen? Like if you look at like zebras are not assaulting their children. Like that's a unique, and even I would say like, I don't think, and again, like it's hard to study such a thing, but I don't think that really happened in like wild caveman societies either. Like that's a modern creation of our society, and we should recognize it as a creation of our society and ask. And I'm not saying there's like a simple like turn the tap off kind of solution to it, but like we should say like, why do people do this? Like, and it's probably complicated reasons having to do with like people feeling powerless or whatever, like, and kind of follow the thread and actually like start to untangle things rather than just like, I think we tend to like make it very simple. That's just like people who do this are bad, they should go to jail. Like
it kind of reminds me of like when cops will, following all the incentives available in the system, will end up shooting someone, and we just like chop off that expression of violence. We just like, oh, that cop is bad, he's going to jail, as if we solved anything, when they're just a rational expression of a broken machine.
Exactly. You got to ask like that's what frustrates me so much about this like bad apples thing. I'm like, there's too many fucking bad apples. And like a quote that I read that I thought was like very profound is like, healthy trees do not bear like strange fruit. Like If you have
Yeah.
bad apples, it's because there's something wrong at a deeper point, right? Like if your tree just like produces a whole batch of rotten apples, you're not like, wow, that's weird. Like you'd be like, there's something wrong with it. It's sick. Like,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, like with police in particular, I'm like, okay, it's been like thousands of incidents of like systemic racism and police brutality and things like that. Like that is not like a handful of individuals just choosing to be shitty. Like,
Yeah. I do think maybe the concept of personal responsibility and trying to apply this can create some incentives, and like it incentivizes like a feedback between relationships that encourages certain types of behavior, even though it's fundamentally a concept that we're going to inconsistently apply.
I will
So
say like something I struggle with in what I'm like proposing here is like, what do we do for the time being? Like, it'd be great to say we're gonna like cut it off at the source and stop like new rapists from being created, but like at some point like we have rapists in our society, and like how should we handle them is a more difficult question. And I'm not saying at all that like we need to completely get rid of prison overnight or anything, but like, so like to your point, like there does have to be some, at this point we need, and always we need a model of personal responsibility to handle the people who fall through the cracks.
well, I do think even without the concept of personal responsibility, we could view a criminal as a purely a force of nature, like a shark or a lion, and still put them behind bars and not necessarily view them as responsible for their own actions and making a choice. But on an aside to that, I do think maybe the concept of personal responsibility and the concept of free will, despite its impossibly long list of philosophical problems, could serve a benefit of creating kind of an artificial incentive where we say, you have this thing where you're choosing, so choose right. And people are like, oh, I have a thing where I'm choosing, and they try to therefore to choose right. Yeah. And maybe that creates some sort of situation where better choices are made, even though they're not like, really choices.
Yeah, like sort of impress upon people that they do have agency and they can do. Like I believe that a lot of criminals, like lifelong criminals, just don't think that there's another path for them. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
I don't really think like the cartoony TV model of like, I'm just a greedy person, I don't want to work. Like, I think a lot of people are like, this is my option. Like, if you grow up in Harlem, maybe you feel like you have to, like, if you really want to feed your family, you've got to sell drugs or whatever, right? Like, I don't know. Yeah. Like, I think that's kind of how people get there.
Yeah, or else they.
Sorry, did you have
I was just gonna say, or they view themselves in some way as the hero of their own story in some twisted context.
Yeah, I think that, I think a lot of criminals say like, I think a lot of people rightly say that like people like Jeff Bezos are stealing tons of money every day too, and not getting caught, and like what's the difference? And I think there's a lot of truth to that as well. What I was going to ask is like we generally have like 3 or maybe 4 outcomes of like our justice system, like our prison system, let's say. So you have like a rehabilitative goal of like taking a criminal in and like fixing them, repairing them somehow so that they can be a productive member of society. There's like a retributive goal of like give this idea of like getting justice for victims, and that like it helps people's healing process to like see the criminal that harmed them put behind bars or whatever. And then we have like and maybe this one is 2 separate ones, but you have like the punishment / deterrent goal that's just to like jail should suck so that people don't want to go to jail, and you deter people from doing crime. And when you that criminal themselves, you punish them in like a sort of conditioning way that will make them not do it again. What do you think are like the important outcomes there, and which ones do you think are less important or maybe don't work or whatever?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, rehabilitation I think is obviously very important and useful for lots of types of crimes and lots of types of criminals.
Yes.
And whenever that's possible, that should be the main goal. For number 2, it was working in both vengeance against the perpetrator and also making the victim whole.
Yeah, like this, I would call it like retribution or retributive justice, which is like this idea that like justice is for the victims, not really for the criminal.
Right, I see what you're saying. Yeah, well, in a sense, I think that's true, and that I would support if someone takes from someone else to whatever degree they can make the victim whole, and to make it so that people who are victimized can, you know, feel that the justice system is going to protect them and compensate them, or, you know, give them back what is theirs. So, but I don't agree that there's a big conflation between justice and vengeance, I think, in how we approach these topics. And I think we should avoid as much as possible to indulge in vengeance. And I think a lot of and because vengeance does rely on the idea of this person chose to be a criminal rather than being a product of its environment. And I think a more, as you say, holistic or rational and wise approach to this would avoid the tendency towards vengeance and would simply focus on the deterrent, the third option of saying, we're going to maybe put this person, make it clear that they're going to, you know, that the fruit is not worth the squeeze. You know, they're not gonna profit from crime, essentially.
Yeah.
And I think because lots of crime is opportunistic, we need to create those rational incentives away from it. So I think 3, is generally a good idea. 1's a good idea. I think 2, we should try to separate it from the more vengeance
Do you
perspective.
think, like, and I say this as someone who's never been the victim of like a serious crime or anything, but do you think like it really does help people heal to like see criminals brought to justice? Or do you think that's sort of like I kind of tend to think of like revenge as sort of like an empty thing that like doesn't really help, like the sort of, you know, the movie thing where it's like seeking revenge is just going to make you more empty inside and things like that. Do you think there is like a real like almost medicinal quality to like seeing that criminal brought to justice? Or is that just like a bad like goal for us to have?
I believe it's probably a bad goal and just a kind of a dark path that should not be indulged, kind of thing. Because it relies on this idea that people are choosing, and oftentimes they are not. They're part of a very different, twisted, broken, you know, mentally ill context. And recognizing that makes the idea of vengeance seem inappropriate.
Yeah, I agree. Largely I agree with your breakdown. Increasingly, I'm skeptical that like justice as a deterrent actually works. Like, there's a lot of research that seems to indicate that like most criminals just assume that they won't get caught, and like when they talk about mandatory minimums, like that's the whole premise there, right? Is that like having large sentences will make people stay away from doing it. And when you like talk to people who are in prison for drug crimes, they all say the same thing, which is, I didn't think I would get caught, so I didn't really like think about the consequences. And so yeah. I agree that it's important. I would question whether in our current implementation, at least, like we actually do deter crime in any meaningful.
I would agree with that. Yeah, I guess I'm not really sure. Maybe it needs to be combined with a healthy cultural attitude.
Our system doesn't do any of those things, in my opinion. Like, our justice system doesn't seem to really like adequately meet any outcome.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not great, for sure. I think there are certain ways in which it succeeds at
providing
1 and 3 for sure, and especially 3. It's pretty good at like making people not want to do crime.
But do you think it is? Like,
well, actually, that's the thing. You just gave an example of how it's not.
Like, I don't want to go to jail. Like, I don't know.
I think for some people that's the case. Although you just brought up some evidence that it's not the case for lots of people. So I don't know. Maybe the justice system is far more broken than I give it credit for. I thought I was appropriately cynical in that regard. Maybe not.
Yeah, I don't know. It's weird. Crime and justice is like a weird thing. It's a weird concept.
It is, yeah.
I think what our justice system really succeeds at is, and maybe this is like another outcome that is harder to quantify, but like there's an aspect of like maintaining order. And I think that's like an outcome that it does do. Like, there's this idea that like police create a stable society. And even if part of that stable society is like gangs or whatever, it's like
Yeah.
stabilized. We
Or at
stopped
least,
like the Joker-y supervillains from emerging that just like disrupt society altogether.
yeah, even if there's like predation, at least it's consistent and predictable predation that allows, like, for instance, investors always want to invest in an economy that has predictable rule of law, so they know what's happening, where their money's going to go 10 years down the line. And I think that's been shown to be a huge factor in the creation of wealth, is stable rule of law. Even if it's imperfect rule of law that tends to favor some at the expense of others, as long as it's consistent.
Yeah, exactly. Like I almost think it's a feature more than a bug that like as an investor in a company, you can be fairly confident that the CEO is not going to go to prison, right? Like
Yeah.
even if they should go to prison, I think that our society doesn't do that. And in some ways that's like a benefit, I guess.
Yeah, from the perspective of the investor, as long as
Yeah.
it's predictable.
Yeah, from the perspective of like the stakeholders, shall we say, like the
Yeah.
important stakeholders. Obviously, everyday people are never important stakeholders, but
Fuck those people.
yeah, no, it's interesting. It is deeply flawed. I think like things like BLM really show how like deeply and systemically flawed it is, because there aren't like quick solutions. Like people are now advocating to just like tear down the whole thing because like incremental change, it doesn't work.
Well, I think as well, I think this is a good example of how the demands are fairly unfocused, and there's not a lot of, like, for instance, when people said we're going to defund the police, right away John Oliver came out and made a video about what does defund the police actually mean, and he basically said it doesn't mean defund police. And then a lot of people are like, no, we actually want to defund the police. So it's like,
that's what I always
people,
say. Like what I've been guilty of saying, defund the police, and when I say it, I mean like get rid of the police. Like maybe put something else in its place, but like I really do think sometimes you just have to cut things off at the root and start over.
yeah, he was literally saying, no, we just need to reduce the budget in certain ways to make it so that cops don't have tanks or whatever.
And there are a lot of people like I do hear a lot of people genuinely like saying that that's what they mean. Like there's certainly a lot of especially moderates that see defund the police as like get rid of tanks and machine guns and like riot gear for police.
Yeah, and it's funny how like they're like they laugh at the idea that this means several different things. Like I've pointed out to some of my friends that, well, actually, this means different things depending on who you are. And they're like, no, it doesn't. It just means one thing. And this is like a very and that's why I think this is going nowhere, is because people don't even realize that people mean vastly different things by an expression like that. And
a manifesto. Like you really need
a good manifesto.
Absolutely. Like, and I know like maybe manifesto is like a charged term, but I really think that's what you need. You need a list of demands that like, this is what we want. Like, and that's never going to represent how everybody feels about the issue. But as soon as you have like there's a lot of power in like written documents. As soon as you have like, these are the things that are on the table, like yes or no, then you can have a meaningful discussion. Whereas as to your point, like it's so decentralized and like all over the place that like it's really hard to have that discussion, because as soon as you start trying to do something, you're gonna have half of those people stand up and say like, no,
yeah,
this isn't what we want at all. Like,
or else maybe just keep it really simple. Like maybe we just need to want to go after issues with like a specific issue with police unions, or a specific issue like qualified immunity. Maybe the movement doesn't have to be this huge amorphous, we are tired of police brutality, and well, that's great. Maybe we need to focus it more in a specific way on one point.
I actually think like I'm going to draw a comparison here to like environmentalism, because I see this as a huge issue in the environmental movement as well. So like if you go back to like the good old days, like go back to like CFCs, for example, like the hole in the ozone layer.
Yeah.
Like that was like a very targeted issue that was met with a very targeted response, and it is like being fixed now, right? Like when we had like DDT that was killing off tons of animals in the environment, like that was a targeted issue with a targeted solution. But now environmentalism has become like with police, like this extremely, like some people literally want us to go to like Ewok society where we live in the trees and there's no electricity and everything. And like some people just want like a 2 cents a liter gas tax, and like there's not a manifesto. There's not like an actual like this is like what needs to be done. and it suffers from the same thing. It's such a decentralized conversation that it never goes anywhere. And the deliverables from the government are like vague sentiments about in the next 50 years, we're going to somehow like lower emissions by this percentage or whatever. Like,
yeah, and I think there's certain elements of the conversation that aren't controversial. And I think if we could have the conversation in a very large, like honest way, and we bring the conversation into more of a focused way and say, okay, we all agree that this would be a great first step.
yes.
And we could rally a lot of momentum behind that. And I think it's really, I don't know if it's telling, I don't want to get conspiratorial, but it's strange that we don't do that and obviously a lot of what governments do with respect to that right now is they want to do a big demonstration of what they're doing. So they choose the avenues that are good PR stunts, like the opening of a massive solar panel, whatever factory, even if it's, not by all rational accounts, not a solution to the problem we're facing.
I know. But even that, like, I would love to see more ribbon cuttings. Like, at least that's something. Like, what drives me crazy, nothing disgusts me more than when I see my government who's up for re-election in like 3 more years have like a 50-year window to like how we're going to solve global warming. I'm like, that is nothing. Like, that's no commitment at all to say that like after I'm dead for 20 years, like bring emissions down. Like, I like 5-year plans. Like, here's what we're gonna do in 5 years, get it done, and then at the end look back and say, what did we do well at, what did we fail at, what worked, what didn't. Like, a more like scientific experimental approach to government, because ultimately it is an experiment. It is like nobody has the answers of how to solve global warming. You have to have a policy that's an attempt to make things better, and then you have to measure whether it works. Like,
yeah, but I think especially with respect to an issue like global warming, a lot of the solutions, like the most effective strategies, I think, are ones that would often expand beyond 5-year plans. And I think one of the reasons why, I think just the problem of the fact that a lot of leadership happens in 4-year stints, or these like, half-decade stints, I think is a big problem because all the incentives related are so bad. I think I like the idea of there being a company that like this is their goal to solve the problem, and it's like they have a strategy that this is going to take 40 years to do this one thing that we're doing. It's going to, in a small way, address the larger problem, and we're going to define the goals along the way every year, every 4 years. And it's like, and they're not bound by an arbitrary term limit.
That was like really standard and had the abilities to like control the market. Like,
sorry,
I said, what if we had like one oil company with a lot of standards that was sort of like monopolizing the market and making the right decisions for society?
Oh, interesting.
Maybe you'd call it like Standard Oil.
Like a Standard Oil.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. Interesting. Okay.
I don't know. I totally understand what you're saying, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I would almost take the exact opposite opinion, which is that I think we should celebrate like I think the shortness allows for like real deliverables and measurables.
That's true.
That like you can approach from that direction. Like, I would really like to see, really as like their campaign, a politician should be saying, this is what I'm going to do in these 4 years. These are the metrics that I'm going to deliver on. And then at the end, like leading up to the next election, we can look at that and say, okay, what actually happened? Like, you said you were going to reduce the debt by this amount. Maybe you did less, maybe you did more, maybe you didn't even put a dent in it. Like, that's something that's very measurable and simple. And so are emissions. Like, we have all the tools now to estimate with enough accuracy to be like, we're emitting less than we were 5 years ago, or we're emitting more, or whatever. It's cleaner, it's dirtier, et cetera, et cetera. And like, if we actually make those things really measurable, we can hold our politicians to account. Whereas in my opinion, like the long-term thing is perhaps fundamentally the right approach, but without like radically changing the way that our system currently works, it just doesn't, it just gives politicians a scapegoat to say like, yeah, like the Kyoto Protocol is going to like mature shortly, and like nothing has happened. Like, everyone signed on to it and just nothing happened. It was like a failure, right? Like, because it was too long term.
Yeah, and like that's talked about a lot in this book false alarm by Bjorn Lomborg, actually, how a lot of the policies and strategies in place are very long-term things that almost none of the countries that signed up for them are following through on. Like New Zealand is a famous example where they had a very ambitious plan to reduce carbon emissions, and they didn't do it at all. Even despite all their optimism and their high idealistic approach, they actually increased emissions because the plan was too ambitious and over too long of scale of time. That
there was no point where it was measured to say like, okay, 4 years in, we were supposed to be here. Where are we at? Like, that's what we need. Like,
yeah, for sure. I mean,
did you read about iron fertilization?
I have not.
Okay, I'm going to explain it to you. So iron fertilization is a highly controversial technology, but essentially, so like to gloss over a lot of the more complicated science, like in the deep parts of the ocean, the limiting factor of algal growth is iron. So like there's a small amount of dissolved iron in the water of our ocean from like ocean vents and like dissolved like solids in river water and things like that. And iron is one of the chemicals you need to do photosynthesis. So like all photosynthesizing organisms need iron as part of that process. And so if you take like granular iron, like they'll basically grind up like a ton of iron into powder and dump it into the ocean, you create like a gigantic algal bloom that absorbs like an immense amount of carbon from the atmosphere in kind of one shot. And then it dies and slowly filters down to the bottom of the ocean where it's like sequestered for thousands of years, right? So like this is like the basic premise of iron fertilization. And like what is important about it is that it's been tested 16 times and it actually works. Like there are measurable results from this, and like it really does sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And in fact, like a lot of global cooling events that we saw in history are theorized to be caused by like natural expressions of the same process. Like a volcano will dump an immense amount of iron into the ocean, and like you see the same results happening as a largely natural process. But it's like it's very opposed by the environmental movement because it's seen as a very like unnatural and like maybe seen as like a dangerous solution that could have unforeseen consequences and stuff like that. And it runs very contrary to, again, like the Ewok society of like people living in trees without electricity. But like it's a technology that really works and like could be like helping, and is just not being done. And it's cheap enough that like it produces like profitably carbon credits in most markets. So like like in Russia, for example, they have like a floor on what carbon credits can go for. So they have sort of a free market of carbon credits, but they can't go for less than like $10 a ton or something like that. Yeah. And like this technology produces it at half of that in terms of like carbon sequestration. So like it's profitable, at least in a market that in any way recognizes carbon capture.
Yeah, once there's a market for
like whether it's like
some sort of I felt the need to express it for anyone watching in a more explicit way. But if there's what's the term? If there's a market for,
usually it's carbon credits.
Sure. Yeah, I guess that's a fine term for it.
Yeah, or carbon capture.
Yeah.
But it's like it boggles my mind that nobody's even fucking heard of this thing, and it's been tested and like it works. Like the scientists are all on. It's in the same camp as nuclear because like the scientists are on board and are like, this will help. This is better, and it just doesn't get done. Like,
there's other forms of geoengineering that I heard about in this book as well. One of them being because the saltwater mist around oceans is great for, I think I forget how it works exactly, but it's supposed to be the reverse of the greenhouse effect where it reflects light. If that's
cloud brightening is what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, I guess there's two forms of that where they either inject a certain type of chemical into the upper atmosphere and create a reflective layer, or else they kind of supplement the growth of seaside saltwater clouds.
Indirectly, this tends to have that effect as well, because you have like absorbed iron moving up into the atmosphere.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess they observed this during a massive volcano eruption where it caused lots of clouds to form around the upper atmosphere, and it caused a large measurable cooling effect on the planet because of how widespread the smoke was. And their scientists are considered reforming that. But obviously there's a lot of, and the salt water one doesn't make me as nervous, because it's like the kind of thing where you pump it, you boost up the salt water in the air, and then as soon as you stop doing the process, it reduces down to natural levels. But the other one, you're actually permanently adjusting or you're putting a chemical in the atmosphere, and that makes me more nervous. But
yeah, even
if, like, as the book says, even if you're not planning to implement it, we should research it so we know if it has horrible side effects, so we can publish those. And in case some rogue nation 100 years down the road, when global warming is much worse, in case they have the opportunity to do it, we want to know that it's a bad idea, so they can know it's a bad idea, so they don't engage in these things. So that kind of convinced me that we should at least be researching it so we know what's going on. But yeah, I'm surprised the book didn't explore that one as well. That's really interesting.
If you like Google it, like
iron fertilization
or deep ocean iron fertilization sometimes. But like, yeah, and it's like, what I like about it is like, it's a remarkably like simple concept. Like, it's not like, as far as like terraforming the planet goes, it's not that complicated. You dump a chemical in the water that makes plants grow. Like,
yeah. And it's one that's like very natural and ubiquitous and can be done,
Yeah, like, and it's been tested. Like, that's the important thing. Like, it has been done. We've seen that it works. We've yet to see like deep issues. Like, there is a concern that if we start doing this on a massive scale, there'll be some like unforeseen consequences. But we haven't gotten any like sense that that's going to occur. It's a purely, like, cautious, what if kind of argument.
Yeah, and the whole idea of carbon capture in general is fascinating. I know there's a challenge by, I think, Al Gore and some other public speaker or politician, where they have a challenge where it's like a $25 million prize to anyone who can produce carbon capture at a certain scale with a certain amount of efficiency. And it hasn't been met yet. I guess all their requirements haven't been met yet. But yeah, it's cool that could be a very big part of the solution, is just some crazy emergent carbon capture technology that pulls carbon from the air.
Yeah. Well, and like, one of the things, like, when I started reading about it, like, as we all talk about like forests and how like plants are going to solve the problem, but like actual forests like only capture carbon for the lifetime of a tree, right? Like, as soon as that tree dies, it rots, and all of the carbon, the actual sequestration of like carbon in the soil through a forest is almost zero and takes like centuries. Whereas this is like very real, like this is going down to the bottom. Yeah. A certain amount of it will like come back up, like it'll dissolve in the water or whatever. But like, yeah, like trees are not the solution. It's really just tying up carbon in biomass. So like, as you increase the world's biomass, more carbon is tied up in like living organisms that hang on to it until they die. But like, it's not really like a long-term solution. This idea that like trees are pulling carbon out of the atmosphere forever is not really correct. They just like hold on to some of it for their lifetime.
Yeah, and even if we view it as a way to process CO2 and turn it into O2, like even if we planted trees all across the planet, the process wouldn't counteract the rate at which we're releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. So it's just it's like a drop in the bucket type solution for sure.
For sure. I'm a big believer in like nuclear energy to solve a big portion of this problem.
Yeah, or just like emergent technology that's probably going to come out in the next 50 or 100 years that's vastly more efficient. And that's why it's, if it is the case that there's not strong evidence that the world's going to end in 10 or 20 years, as Bjorn Lomborg states and kind of defends, then we should be not so worried about a short-term solution. If it's going to cripple us in the long term, we should be worried about building our economy, growing our economy, becoming wealthy, and pouring money into R&D so we can explore these better solutions and not cripple us in the short term, so we can actually solve it 100 years from now. And I think that's kind of where I'm at now is my current perspective, and I'm ready to be debunked by people who know more about the UN science. But
I guess like my challenge to that is that I think a piece of it just has to be that our own energy consumption needs to be controlled. And I don't think
and
that approach does anything to incentivize like what the sky is falling narrative, which like I don't think in 20 years we're all going to be dead, but I really do think like it will get to a point where every year that we go without solving it, it becomes harder to solve is the problem in my eyes. Like every year there's more factories being built, there's more coal being burned. And like, as you put carbon up there, like it's not just, there's two different problems. You have to stop like polluting, and then you also need to like deal with what's up there already, right? So
yeah, I and I should mention he is a advocate of a carbon tax that ramps up with production. So it would be something that starts small, and as economies grow, it would slowly grow as well to not destroy GDP, but to offset the growth of those technologies that are reliant on fossil fuel as well, subtly incentivizing other technologies without,
Mhm.
without the central planning that's involved in like direct subsidy that always goes so awry, but just allowing markets to form and just a slow ramping up of a carbon tax, I think.
What appeals to me about a carbon tax is it's like equal. You know what I mean? Like the subsidy
Yeah.
thing. And I think there is like, and we'll perhaps disagree on this, but I think it's important for us to subsidize green technologies because we subsidize like dirty technologies for so long. And like to say that like, oh, well, we're not like invading countries to get oil now. So like, why can't green technologies just catch up? Like our government did a lot. Oil has been like the number one foreign policy objective for the better half of like a century now. And like, there's something to be said for like other technologies need a helping hand to catch up, I think.
For sure, but I guess I like the idea of more focusing on the research and development, but not so much like I don't support pouring any subsidies into wind and solar at this point. Like I think those are kind of just a bit of a black hole for. I think once battery technology evolves to the point where we can actually, hold on to energy for a little longer, then it makes more sense. But I think there can begin of a dangerous temptation to shift so much resources towards things like biomass or wind and solar.
I think like it can be very useful to separate it into like two different problems. So we have the problem of like providing energy for industry, and like we need an immense amount of power for their factories and like things of that nature. And then we also need to meet like people's individual energy needs. And I think that is a place where perhaps like you can relatively effectively like put solar panels on somebody's roof and electricity while they're awake, and then that sort of peters off at the end of the day. And like things like that, like people's individual energy needs are a very different problem, and a big part of that is that we use way too much energy, and like that's often the most inefficient use of energy as well. Like if you take a gallon of gasoline and burn it in a power plant, you get much more energy out of it than burning it in your like car, because there's just an efficiency of scale there.
Okay.
And cool. Like ideas like this. So I do think like solar and wind can be important as individual energy solutions to power a home. But I agree with you that the idea of like largely powering like the industrial needs of our society is not going to be achieved with anything other than fossil fuels or nuclear energy, in my opinion.
Yeah, or the next crazy technology coming down the pipe that we haven't even considered yet.
Yeah, agreed. We may have like where solar really can work is if you have them like a satellite up in space where like the atmosphere isn't in the way and you can absorb like the pure radiation from the sun. So if we ever had a technology to beam that down to Earth and utilize it somehow, that might be like the best possible solution.
Yeah, that'd be sweet. That's the thing. There's so many different approaches to this problem. It's cool to see yeah, as someone who's very optimistic about it, I like the idea of it's going to be so many different types of human innovation that come together to solve it. It might just be one technology, but it's probably going to be a combination of carbon capture, maybe some degree of geoengineering with emergent technologies, and the refining of the nuclear process.
Yeah.
But
I think like fundamentally, like the real shift that has to happen is like, it's like comparing to nuclear, for example. When you talk to people about nuclear, their first question is always like, how do you deal with nuclear waste?
yeah,
And like nobody asks that question about like oil and gas.
yeah,
Like if you had to capture that and keep it somewhere, it would be an impossibly expensive technology. Like if you
yeah,
had to like deal with the emissions from your car, you wouldn't be able to afford to drive. You can only do it because you're just pumping it up into the atmosphere and it's somebody else's problem. So like if you look at nuclear, like really it produces much less waste than oil and gas. It just produces like solid waste that you can't just like, you know, put up into the air. Like, and if you did incinerate it, people wouldn't be okay with that.
yeah. Back to square one.
Yeah. So
But yeah, no, that's I know you. That's a good point. I obviously I think we need to do a whole talk about this whole topic that's like more focused, because I think I'm going to reread this book, and I'm going to try to find more criticisms of Bjorn Lomborg, or just like supplemental perspectives, like that one guy mentioned neurotoxins. That's something I was never thought of, and
yeah.
never mentioned in that book. And I'd like to do a little bit more research, but once I do, I definitely want to do a focused talk on this video.
I would highly recommend. I think I gave you his name already, but Michael Schallenberger is like a big advocate of nuclear energy and a critic of like solar and wind, and tends to be of the opinion that like the shift towards solar and wind has actually been very destructive, because like we're shutting down nuclear power plants as we build like fields full of windmills that don't do anything. And
Yeah.
Yeah, he has some interesting ideas.
I also want to learn more about why exactly nuclear power plants have gotten so much more expensive over the last 40 years. And because the explanation given that I've heard is that there's a combination of government regulation that is implemented halfway through production, oftentimes, where they're building a plant and then government's like, well, we need also these standards that must be satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the idea that plants, there's been some studies that suggest that the designs of nuclear power plants got much more complicated, and they pursued many different types of plants. Whereas if we had focused on a more limited type of plant and like only focused on like one design, for instance, we would be able to, you know, make that we would hone it better, and the technology would get cheaper. But because we didn't do that, it got more expensive. But I don't know. Yeah, I need to learn more about, because it seems crazy that it's so expensive right now, and it's actually people aren't building them because it's not cost effective, but it's like that, just based on my very limited understanding of the technology, it seems very backwards that would be the case, that they're not cost effective.
Something that I think would be really interesting to dig into with you is like one of the narratives about nuclear energy is that as energy increasingly became like a sort of a corporate market, like almost all the nuclear plants that have ever existed in history were built by the government and run by the government. And like nuclear is a much less appealing as like a corporate model, just because of like realities of the technology. Like nuclear plants have to have like outages during the year more so than like an oil and gas plant, which means you need to coordinate with like other people on the grid and things like that. And it's very hard to achieve those outcomes. And it's like a prohibitively huge investment to get it started, and things like this. And so like there's an argument to be made, at least, that sort of like privatization of the energy sphere is a big part of what pushed nuclear out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And oil and gas tend to work much better in the private sector. So yeah, I think that would be really interesting to dig into.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, that's a whole other element to it that I have not explored at all. So I'd like to. Yeah. Bottom line, I need to learn. There's a few things I've learned I need to learn more about. I want to read some books on nuclear energy and also ocean acidification. And maybe those things need to happen before we do talk about this. But yeah, ocean acidification is something I'd want to learn way more about, because that's, briefly talked about in that book. And I know the principle that, you know, makes it harder for
Yeah.
marine life that relies on the formation of calcium-based shells, harms their growth. So
Yeah.
any like shellfish or corals or
Absolutely. You know what also helps with ocean acidification? Deep ocean iron fertilization.
that will.
Because you're introducing like I always get them confused. Like a cation, I guess. Like the iron will like be latched onto by like acids in the ocean, right? Because it's like
Right.
it's positive and acids are negative. So
Cool.
yeah, it also helps with that.
Because honestly, ocean acidification is the part of global warming or climate change that scares me the most. I'm not really I'm not concerned about it very much, to be honest, in general,
Climate change.
especially in the short term. Sorry?
Yeah, just climate change in general.
Yeah, especially in the short term.
Yeah.
I tend to be of the camp that it's not a very concerning thing, but especially ocean acidification freaks me out.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to learn more about that. And yeah, that's iron fertilization. Okay.
I'm telling you, man. You read about it, it will blow your mind, and your question will be, "Why the fuck didn't anyone ever tell me about this?" Like,
honestly,
it's a proven technology that works. Like,
well, I don't understand why this book that I just read that has no reason not to advocate that had a section on geoengineering did not mention this, and it came out in like 2020 or 2019. Like what?
well, I mean, I'm selling it, to be fair, but like is not well liked in environmental circles, again, because it's seen as like a very maybe you could think of it as like a very unnatural solution to global warming, whereas a lot of environmentalists are like naturalists that are looking for like,
yeah,
like that's not living in harmony with the planet, that's just like doing another thing to fix the problem.
for sure. And I mean, Bjorn Lomborg, the author of this book, recognizes that that's the reason why environmentalists tend to shy away from geoengineering. Yeah. It seems very strange to me that that wasn't mentioned, honestly, that would have been a great addition to his perspective.
Well, it might even be that he wasn't aware of it. Like, it's not,
for sure.
Again, it's not well reported on.
Come on, Bjorn, what the hell? Yeah, that's sweet.
It's not quite wood, but it's also interesting. We have like specific minerals on our planet, like limestone and marble, that only exist because we have shellfish for like hundreds of millions of years. Like,
really?
Yeah, because like when you have like limestone, what it is like basically shells that fell to the bottom of the ocean, or what was ocean at one point, and then were compressed for like thousands of years or whatever, and they become
marble.
That's why, like, did you ever do the experiment in school where you put like vinegar on limestone and it'll like fizz?
I think it did that.
Yeah, so that's why, because it's like the calcium carbonate that shells are made of will like fizz off, just like baking soda, which is sodium carbonate.
And you said marble as well is produced by.
Yeah, so marble is like the metamorphic rock made from limestone. So when you have limestone that's then exposed to like high pressure and volcanic heat, it will be compressed into marble. And I believe, I'm leaving my area of expertise, but I believe the calcium is what makes like marble white. Like it's the same reason it makes our bones white.
Do people artificially make marble out of limestone? Like out of?
I'm sure you could, like in a laboratory setting. Like it's certainly achievable amounts of heat and pressure, but it wouldn't be like sustainable. Like it wouldn't be able to compete with mining.
Right, you could just much more easily find it at the ground. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so like limestone would be another material that like wouldn't be readily available in most of the earth. I also had one more thing, and then we can start wrapping up probably. But you were talking about like the wheels. So here's like a realization I had when I talked to somebody at the university about the pyramids. So like you have the pyramids in Egypt and the pyramids in like Mesoamerica, and they, as similar as they look, they were built with like fundamentally distinct technologies because Mesoamericans didn't utilize the wheel. So like we think of like these two societies, and there tends to be this discussion of like, oh, like aliens came and taught us how to make pyramids or whatever. But like the way that Aztec pyramids were built is like completely removed, because Egyptians, it was all like rollers and pulleys and things like that weren't used. in America. So it's kind of fascinating to think that like we came up with two different ways to build like a gigantic stone mountain.
Yeah, that's wild. I'm still like, it does seem like history goes way further back than we were previously willing to consider, and like how we thought that all Native Americans came over the Bering Strait 12,000 years ago, and now we're like considering that they're over here like 50,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago. And I'm open to the idea that maybe there was some incredibly, ancient ancestor that thought pyramids were very important, and that's why we have them all over the world. But it blows my mind. Any deep history stuff, it's like it gets into a territory of just possibilities, unknowable possibilities that are all just very wild.
Right? I always find it, I think it's just a fascinating discussion in general of like,
yeah,
how we got here. Like the idea of like archetypes that you're kind of digging into. I actually just had a conversation today about like maybe that's a vestige of evolution, where at some point like we had symbols imprinted upon like our little proto-mammal shrew brain that like were important, like how like trees represent life in like all sorts of societies everywhere, and like tree symbolism in like your god of fertility or whatever is like exceedingly common. And like maybe that's just a vestige of like our mammal brain that's like trees are good, like when you see trees that will be like a good place to have babies or whatever, like, and that's just like now something like in our much more complicated brain that we just pull out of our brainstem, and we're like, yeah, like trees are life. Like most mammals, for most of history, mammals were predated primarily by reptiles. So maybe like the dragon imagery we see in all sorts of different cultures is like just this like archetype of like a fearsome generic reptile that we want to stay away from, or that expresses like danger upon us. Yeah,
I love and I absolutely think there are like very like foundationally imprinted symbology. There's like in our brain, and just like the idea of that sacred geometry could be an expression of these things is, I love that. And like the divine ratio and our affinity for these types of things is some sort of reference to a very primitive association for symbology that was for some reason useful for our survival. Is something that makes sense to me, but it's just in the category of,
there's like an example of a thought that is like evolutionary instilled in us. So like primates are the only, well, not the only, but primates are one of the only mammals that has like a natural fear of heights. Like all primates are naturally have like this, even ones that don't live in trees anymore, like gorillas, have this like natural like vertigo sensation that makes us scared of like precipitous heights. And humans still have this today. And that's just like hardwired into us because we needed an idea of like, this is too high up. Like if you fall, it will kill you. And like a mouse doesn't need that, so it doesn't have it. Or like a rhinoceros is never going to be in a high place and die from falling, but like monkeys die from falling all the time. And so like we now, even though like we don't fall very often, like we're hardwired to have this like this tree is too high concept in the back of our head. Like there really are thoughts that are passed down to us from our ancestors.
Yeah, I absolutely think that.
Yeah.
Much in the same way when I often think about this when I play with cats or dogs, how all cats love chasing string. All of them do.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's the height of hubris when human beings are like, oh, we're just blank slates. We're just like the product of culture. We're just like this like thing that's created by our society. Like, no, you are absolutely, much like all of the animals you interact with as pets. Like you have all these subtle inclinations that you think you chose but are a product of like deep history.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
And I think these subtly work their way into our behavior in innumerable ways that we don't even have the capacity to recognize because we're probably predisposed to not see it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of interesting. I always find like the idiosyncrasies of evolution are fascinating. How like one of the products of evolution is that we hang on to things that we don't need anymore because like it's hard to lose things. Like, you know. So like a lot of these ideas are those. Like I don't think we need to have a dragon like printed stamped on the back of our head anymore, but like it's there and it will take a long time because there's not usually a big incentive to lose something. There's incentive to do things. So like it takes a long time. We still have a tailbone. We haven't had tails for millions of years, but like it's just there.
We're probably gonna have
Other mammals don't have tailbone. Yeah.
vestigial fear of snakes for millennia to come, I bet.
Yeah. That's a perfect example. Yeah, it's cool. Like that's why cats are scared of like cucumbers. Hey, is that like it just triggers that like snake thing. But maybe again, like maybe in the cat's head, that's actually this like dragon thing that a shrew picked up in the dinosaur era and just passed all the way down in the pipe. You know, we never lived with dinosaurs, but certainly our ancestors did.
Yeah, somewhere down the line, we developed some sort of relationship with them in a previous form.
Yeah, and it makes sense that like the original mammals were very, very small and they lived alongside dinosaurs, and they had an instinct that was like, when you see a dragon, you fuck off, because it was and there's no way, like the first mammal to kill a lizard would have been like, you know, comparatively much later.
Oh man, what if the slaying, like George slaying the dragon, is a myth that represents like our evolutionary knowledge of the first mammal who developed the strength and size to kill a lizard.
Right.
Oh my god.
It's fascinating that like still today we really don't hunt lizards. Like there's no point, there are no real human societies that like subsist on lizards. Like I think we still very much do. Like even as humans today, if you think of lizards, the ones you think of are like alligators and snakes, like the ones that hunt you, right? You don't think of geckos. That's nobody's first thought, I don't think. It's big, scary lizards.
Komodo dragon.
Yeah, the Komodo dragon, right? Like, Komodo dragons are really cool. I could do a whole spiel about them, but...
Did you know that they become asexual under pressure?
Really? Don't a lot of lizards do that? I think that's
a lot of them do, yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of lizards and fish. Because they go to a new island and they need to reproduce and there's no one around them, so they triggers a response to become asexual under that pressure.
I believe it's the Komodo dragon, although it might be the Gila monster that I'm thinking of. But it, rather than creating venom, its teeth like dig into its gums and it bleeds into its own mouth to make like a noxious poison.
Yeah. Just like gross bacteria bullshit.
When they bite something, it slowly kills it.
Oh, and it just like follows them for days. Like,
yeah. Have you ever seen like the videos of just like a colony of like Komodo dragons standing next to like a sick wildebeest, and you're like, oh my god. Like,
I think it was in Life, either Life or Planet Earth, that did a big section on Komodo dragons.
And you're like, man,
good stuff.
Cool
terrifying.
That, like a lizard has that developed of a brain. Like that requires like a certain amount of like a lot of instinct to be like, I'm gonna bite this thing and then follow it for 4 days and then it's gonna die. You know what I mean? Like that's no other animal is living that way.
I'm sure there's not a lot of conscious thought. It's probably just like, I'm going to bite it and then follow it. And I have a good instinct that this is going to work out all right or something.
I kind of think, I don't know. I think animals have like primitive thought. Like they're something. Like, do you think, here's another one that I like to think about. Like, do you think a caterpillar, when it spins a cocoon, knows that it's turning into a butterfly? Or does it just spin a cocoon, like, and be like, what am I doing? Like, why am I doing this?
I would guess that, you know, especially in the case of a caterpillar, because it seemed like a very base form of consciousness, I would guess that it's just drawn to the act and has no conscious awareness of where it will go.
Brings it pleasure almost to like spin the cocoon when it's like, it's just so weird to me. Like all sorts of insects metamorphic, and it's just like weird. Same with like a tadpole turning into a frog. Like at some point, is it like I'm ready to leave the water, or like it's just a weird thought?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably like, I don't know, like it's like a cat cleaning itself. Like it probably starts with like a cat has like a nervous tick where it wants to lick itself, and then maybe over time it develops an appreciation for cleanliness and like things like that. But so it's probably like a feedback loop between conscious thought and instinctual direction. But especially for complex animals, but. For
sure, like obviously
it's easier when you talk about
tied up with like
mammals.
Like when you talk about mammals. But mammals, like, and maybe part of that is that like mammals don't do that, right? Like mammals in particular largely come out more or less what they're gonna be their whole life. Like more so than like any like less developed organism, like we don't change much at all. And maybe that's part of it. Like maybe a whole bunch of your brain needs to be devoted to having life cycles. Like there's a whole piece of a caterpillar consciousness that is like isn't useful to the butterfly, so like you can't be as complex of an organism, whereas like mammals can have more complex psychological behaviors because like, you know, a 6-week-old shrew is living the exact same way as a 2-year-old shrew. Like it is
his final form.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you know, you kind of get to develop just one thing throughout your entire life rather than having like stages that have to be abandoned.
Man, I want to learn more about evolutionary stuff again. Evolution is so cool.
It's so cool.
God. This conversation is getting me really pumped on that.
Yeah. Isn't it weird that like all DNA can do is like code for like making different chemicals in your cells. Like when you have like your string of DNA, like what it actually does in the cell is take like bits and pieces in and it spits out different proteins depending on how things are lined up. And like that is enough complexity for not just like every human, but like all creatures ever. That you're like, you know, this specific like fucking combination of chemicals in these ratios in the cell gives you like a frog, and if you tweak these chemicals you'll get a human.
Yeah, if you fuck up enough time over enough millennia, then you're going to end up with a completely different species.
Like, yeah, it's just so weird that like, you know, I think we tend to think like, oh, like this piece of DNA goes up and like changes the color of your eyebrows, but like that's not really how it works. It's just like all of your cells produce more of this chemical or whatever, and like that somehow the like combined product of all of that is that you have a different color of eyebrows. Like,
yeah, and I still have like the most basic understanding of epigenetics as well. So like epigenetics is that whole other layer of genes being turned on and off by environmental exposure, and it's like I have the most that's a whole other thing that I need to learn more about because I have a storybook understanding of what the hell they're talking about.
Oh yeah. Well, I don't think like as a society we understand it very well. So
okay, good.
You're not far behind, but like
sweet.
Yeah. That's weird. It's kind of cool that there's just so much science. Like,
yeah.
I feel like if you went back like 2,000 years ago, there wasn't so much science. Like if you went to, when you were like Aristotle, you went to study under Plato, and after like 3 years, you knew all of the science. Like,
basically,
you know what I mean? He's like, here's the plants that don't kill you. Like, here's the shapes. Like, you're done. Here's your doctorate's degree. Like, and now like there's just so much science. Like literally, you couldn't know it all.
No, yeah.
And it's kind of like fascinating that we have like this shared cultural knowledge that doesn't really rest in any one place or one individual.
Totally, absolutely. Yeah, that is really cool. How
like when you look at Aristotle's the perfect example because he just did all science. Here's physics, here's biology, here's like my writings on like how humor works. Like he just did everything, and like at no point was he like, I don't know enough about chemistry, because there just wasn't enough chemistry. The chemistry was like nothing, and he's like, maybe there's 5 chemicals and stuff that, like, you know what I mean? Like
totally. And I like to think about like as this process evolves further, the most accurate worldview will be one that is held by tons of people.
Yeah.
It won't be the kind of thing that one person, as you say, can know. So it'll be like the most accurate worldview of reality will be something that's shared by like a massive group of people.
So one of the like Archimedes is like my big like sciencey hero guy. And like one of the big texts by Archimedes that's like mind-blowing is like he wrote something called the Sand Reckoner, which is just basically about how to write down large numbers. Because in Greek, you couldn't conceptualize a number bigger than 10,000. They had like the myriad, which was 10,000. And like there was no concept of like having multiple myriads or like a myriad and 5. Like after 10,000, the numbers just cut off. And they were like, these are all the numbers we'll ever meet. And he writes like a book about like, here's how we could make bigger numbers. And it's just like so weird today to be like, people needed to invent like 10,001, like, and relatively like late in the game. Like, you know, this is after like Euclid and all that, like they've done all sorts of math with 10,000, and then a
Yeah, it's crazy to
brilliant
think about.
mathematician comes along and he's like, what about like 10,000 10,000s? And it like blew people's mind.
Man, you told me about a lot of cool topics today. Ocean or iron fertilization being a big one, but I think the fact that a myriad literally means 10,000 is the coolest fact I learned today. That's sweet.
Yeah.
Or it meant back in the day.
Mhm.
That's so trippy.
Yeah.
That's a great trivia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, like, yeah, it's just weird. Like, reading
Yeah,
ancient science is fascinating because, like, just going back to being like, this is how they saw, like, the world. And, like,
and just the difficulties of conceptualizing so many issues and problems when you only have 10,000 is such a
Yeah.
funny limit and restriction. Like,
it's such a, maybe I should send you, like, an English translation. Like, basically, like, the plot of the whole story is, it's like, he's telling a story in order to, like, introduce all this math he's done. But the plot of the story is that he wants to figure out how many grains of sand fit in the universe. And, like, he constructs all of this mathematics to, like, attempt that calculation. One of which is, like, it's going to be more than 10,000. So,
by the way, I should break it to you now.
yeah. And, like, obviously he doesn't even come close. But, like,
Yeah.
just, like, the concept. And he's like, oh, well, like, probably, like, the ratio of, like, the Earth to the sun is the same as, like, the ratio from, like, the edge of the universe to the Earth or whatever. Like, he does all these weird math things just to sort of introduce ideas. But, like,
Right.
it's a bizarre text. But at the end, he does. You have to respect that he, like, spits out a number. He's like, this is the number of grains of sand in the universe. Like,
it was 1 myriad myriads.
Yeah. No, it's more than that. Like, it's a pretty big number, but yeah. Yeah, he kind of, that's where, like, the underpinnings of, like, sort of how we do it now, where we say, like, we have, like, groups of 3 digits and you have thousands of thousands of thousands of thousands. Like, that's all the underpinnings. The initial work of doing that was
okay. Yeah, ancient math is something that I'm not ready for. My brain still has difficulty conceptualizing.
Archimedes is the coolest scientist that ever lived.
Okay. Maybe we'll do a thing on him, and
I would love
for the research. I'll do some exploration. I still feel bad that I never watched all the videos for our union one, but this time got away from me, and I didn't realize there was a 2-hour video in there.
I know.
But
well,
in the future,
because, like, I find that either, and I'm sure you found this too, like, the short videos cap off at about, like, 10 minutes, and then there's, like, a huge jump to, like, you're watching a 2-hour documentary, right?
Yeah,
like,
totally.
Yeah, like, I've been watching a shitload of, like, John Stossel stuff. I find him really interesting, and, like, he's usually right in that, like, 10-minute range where he can, like, just dig into it enough, but, like, he's not, like, you know, expositing for hours about anything.
Yeah, it definitely, you're right though. There's that shift from, like, 10, 15-minute video, and it's just like your afternoon.
Yeah. Same with, like, when we did, like, scientific literacy, like, there's, like, the 3-minute, like, what is this? And it's with, like, cool, like, kid-friendly graphics. And you jump from, you either have that or you have, like, here's, like, a recorded lecture at a university about, like, what is this? And it's some guy droning on for 2 hours.
Like a badly mic'd sound system, and just, like,
totally, like, PowerPoint slides being recorded from somebody's phone. Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, we're at 3 hours, so maybe we should call it a day. That was a long
I guess, man. How do I do final thoughts on this video? I do think that I really like the idea of doing maybe every 2 months we do, like, a random exploration of ideas and just, like, kind of address things we've talked about before, what I've learned more about them, and talk about what we want to do in the future, because it's kind of cool.
Absolutely. I always like on channels that I watch, I love watching videos like this that are just
me too.
Like, here's us, like, hashing it out, kind of.
Yeah, bouncing different topics back and forth to each other, and, like, because
and there's
it's really
some
cool
things you'd never visit otherwise. Like, I was thinking of, before you mentioned that you wanted to do this, I was thinking of doing, like, a concept of, like, a quick fire episode where we're like, let's do, like, 5, like, you know, little minute segments on, like, random things. But this I actually enjoy quite a bit better.
I think that's a great idea. Like, I want to do a video on debunking Howard Zinn, but probably not a whole video because
Yeah.
I just want to give a brief explanation as to why I fundamentally disagree with that book and what kind of arguments they're putting forward. But that wouldn't be very much time. So.
Yeah. The quickfire one that I was thinking of doing is like really digging in, like doing some like supply demand graphs for like a couple economics problems, like maybe some surprising results in economics or whatever. And like talk about things like we've talked about, like the idea of like minimum wage can actually increase employment and stuff like that. And like actually in like a brief 5-minute explanation, like put a graph on screen, talk about the math. It doesn't need to be a huge back and forth because it's not really like it's not me saying like this is absolutely true. It's like here's the math of how this could work. It's not really like open to question. Like
yeah, no, I need to learn more about that particular argument. That's an interesting one that I've never heard that anywhere else but from you. It's surprising.
There's like one particular study in New Jersey. I can't remember if I ever sent it to you or not, but that was like they found this result, which is that like as the minimum wage had gone up, they saw employment go up as well. And this was it's sort of like a eggheady, like ivory tower explanation of how something like that, how you could produce a result like that.
I gotcha. Cool.
Mostly because of like, it's captured by the fact that employees generally all demand to be paid the same wage. If you have employees being paid different amounts to do the same job, then you don't see that. And you also need an upward sloping supply curve.
Our damn valuing of equality.
I know.
Kind of gets in the way of market
Giving
forces.
Everyone more jobs, like what a bad outcome. No, I don't know. Like, yeah, and there's like a couple ones. Like, I'd love to talk about just like healthcare and like briefly show like this is kind of like why you see different results in like the cost of a medicine versus the cost of like tires for your car, like because of the way the graphs are shaped and stuff like that. Like, and I feel like I could do 5 of those quick bing bang boom and do like an episode like that.
Cool, sweet.
Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts on what we've...
If aliens come to colonize, they will do it for the wood and the limestone.
You know what? I was so upset when we brought back to full circle where you referenced that like 10 minutes ago you referenced the idea of like you brought it back to wood, and I was hoping that we would just end it there because it's like a perfect full circle. But I'm glad that you.
Next episode, I'm gonna have like 5 more thoughts about wood. My favorite one is the knocking on the door thing. Like wooden doors are specifically like well suited for knocking, and then we would not knock on a non-wooden door.
And you don't smoke weed? Is that... I feel the need to confirm this at this point in time.
I do not smoke weed. Although I had Thanksgiving with my cousin yesterday, and he's like on this thing where he wants me to smoke weed with him. So I might try it once just to see.
Okay. And I'm sure your thoughts about wooden doors will become...
I'll have so many more thoughts about wood.
Like you'll hone them.
Next time you knock on a wooden door, you're gonna think about this conversation, and that's like my favorite part. That like you're gonna be like, yeah, this wouldn't work with a stone door. This wouldn't work with like a reed door. Thanks, Tyson.
It does create a very like satisfying sound. A wooden knock.
Yeah, like wood is like this really nice like mixture of like not being totally hollow but not being totally solid. Like far denser from other far less dense than other naturally occurring solids.
I think this should be a theme. We'll revisit the wood. I promise.
Yeah, we'll do a full episode on wood. You're hearing it now. It's like I will come up with an hour and a half worth of shit to talk about with wood.
It's like after an hour and a half, then I'll have time to ask my questions, and then we'll have the rest of the video.
Exactly.
It starts with an hour and a half of just like wood-based monologue.
And another thing.
Yeah, like
how would you have the bow and arrow without wood? It's specifically suited to like fucking material.
I'll try to like jump in, and you'll just be like, actually, no, I'm a bit of a run here. Almost done.
I'd be like, let me just get into my thing about how ballistics as a mathematical physical discipline was only possible because of wood, and we would never have like built catapults out of any other material. It's true, by the way.
I like it. Okay. Well, I mean,
Those are my closing thoughts.
save it for the video.
Invest in limestone.
Sweet. It's gonna be big. Limestone and just like, yeah.
I quite literally think that aliens will give us diamonds in exchange for wood and limestone. That would be
Or
the
like,
thing.
or like
Gold,
heirloom,
like gold is relatively prevalent, like in other places. Like
or like just heirloom seeds of like unique oak wood. Like that'll be like,
it'll be just like coffee. Like they'll be trying to sneak them out, and we'll be like, "Yo, give us back those acorns." Like that was never part of the deal.
man, I think this would be a good short story, or a good basis for a short story.
Yeah. What else would you build? What else could you have that floats? If you were going to build a boat, the only material that you could use is wood.
Well, I mean,
Until you have like the extremely sophisticated airtight metalworking of like the modern era.
I mean, there are lots of like perhaps even like the bulbs of what are those? That seaweed that floats. Kelp. Kelp has bulbs in it that float. Maybe you could dry sponges and coat them with some sort of like you could. Oh damn it! I was gonna say you coat sap. Sap is from trees. Okay.
There's
back up.
another one.
You could take some sticky substance and cover a dry
How
sponge with it.
Gum without trees, without wood.
Rubber in general.
Rubber comes from wood.
Like I don't want to add to your side of the argument here, but that's kind of a good point to make as well. Rubber in general would be part of your whole thesis, I think.
Oh yeah. I am writing a thesis, by the way. It just says wood at the top in all caps, and it's 87 pages. Every page starts with "and another."
I was literally going to say the top of every paragraph should be "and another thing." Oh my god, that'd be amazing.
Right. Think of how many of our instruments are made of wood.
Everything. It has the best sound acoustically.
Yeah.
Maybe these aliens are big fans of music.
Like the acoustic guitar couldn't exist. The most ubiquitous instrument, the violin. Like
Woodwind
no Stradivarius without wood.
Yeah, absolutely. Cellos.
It'd be all the crappy plastic instruments that nobody wants to play.
Tuning forks.
Tuning forks are made of metal.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's like the only thing that they could play with the absence of metal.
That's true. You could
That's
play
what you're left with.
a piano, I guess you could do without wood.
Yeah, but the wood of the piano is so important for the acoustics. They have made like plastic polymers that have, recreated similar acoustics, but in general, and I've met lots of purists who are like, the idea of a non-wooden piano is like disgusting to them.
Yeah.
But
I'm out of my element there. You're the music guy, but like, yeah.
But I can say.
Do you know what the theremin is?
I do. I actually owned a theremin.
Really?
Yeah.
That's sick. What do you mean owned? You got rid of your theremin?
It unfortunately stopped working.
Oh.
It broke. But it's just literally a box with an antenna. That's all it was.
Yeah. And don't you like kind of just like poke your finger in different places and it makes different sounds?
Yeah, it's supposed to be it measures proximity to it. So if you circled it around at the same distance, it would be the same tone. But it's like proximity to the end of the antenna.
Okay.
And also there's like another one.
Like something about like up and down gives you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then.
Yeah, because you can put one finger by the base of the antenna, and then up and down is the volume, and then near the top is like the tone. So it's like louder, higher, quieter, lower tone kind of thing.
Yeah.
I said that weird, but yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure somehow it couldn't be done without wood, but.
I don't know about that one, but that's kind of a weird instrument anyway. It's not like,
would we even invent music without wood? Probably not.
I mean, maybe you could like people, although metal's a big one, but where people like will take like a sheet of metal and like hammer holes in it and make like what are those called? The steel drums.
Yeah.
Like they hammer dimples in it and make like.
Yeah. That's true. You still get metal, I think. Although I question whether we would develop metal without wood, but. Would we even have become monkeys were there not trees for us to frolic in?
We would be without opposable thumbs.
Yeah.
We'd be crawling across the grasslands, chewing our cud with our four stomachs like chumps.
Exactly. There's no fruit. There's no like, yeah. You can't make whiskey without wood. Okay, well, those are my final thoughts.
Those are very good final thoughts. I have nothing to add to that. That's perfect. Wood.
Wood. Wouldn't you like to know?
That'll be the name of the episode.
Yes. We're actually going to do that. I'm going to start working on a wood episode. You're going to have a playlist of videos about wood.
Have you read The Secret Life of Trees?
No.
Read it. That should be your I haven't read it either, but I have a friend who's very intelligent who's told me to read The Secret Life of Trees. Apparently it's
paper. You don't get paper without wood.
Okay, well. It's a lot of wood-based technology. Yeah. It's true, that's a big one.
Door knocking is the biggest one though.
That's definitely the funniest one. I love that you brought it up so emphatically so early in the conversation.
It's when you start to think about it, you're like, yeah, we wouldn't knock. We would have to invent a doorbell. Like if you had a stone door, you would need a doorbell.
It's true. Yeah, it's true. That kind of echoing acoustics. Anything that, yeah, man. I wanted to resist this whole wood ideology, but it's true that it's like very fundamental to the
narrative
experience.
Of big wood is like standard wood wants to corner the market.
Exactly. That's one of the great things about it is it's such an open source technology that it cannot be monopolized.
Open source technology.
Yeah,
it's true. Anyone can grow their own trees.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us on this wild adventure exploring wood and other topics.
Wood Part 1 will be the name.
Wood Part 1. This is like the preamble to wood.
Yeah. Cole's notes of wood.
Sweet.
Okay. See you guys next time on Coyotenomics.